Hey guys, tonight we're stepping through the front door of a Victorian boarding house. One of those towering, narrow brick buildings where single clerks, shop girls, struggling artists, and down on their luck gentry all crammed together under one roof. Picture gaslight flickering in dim hallways, the smell of boiled mutton drifting from the basement kitchen, and paper-thin walls that guarantee you'll know everything about your neighbours, whether you want to or not. You're about to become intimately familiar with shared chamber pots, breakfast table hierarchies, and the terrifying woman who controls it all with nothing but a ledger book and a withering stare. Here's your reality check. If you think modern roommate drama is bad, try sharing a single bathroom with 15 strangers while maintaining Victorian respectability. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, drop a comment letting me know where you're watching from and what time it is where you are. I'm always curious about where this channel reaches. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. It's 1885, and you're standing on the front steps of number 47 Marchmont Street, your carpet bag gripping handles worn smooth by anxious hands before yours. The boarding house towers 4 stories above you, its brick facade darkened by decades of London coal smoke until it's nearly black. A handwritten card in the ground floor window reads, "Respectable lodgings, references required." You probably walked past 3 similar establishments before settling on this one, each looking nearly identical with their narrow fronts, and the same weary respectability clinging to their peeling paint. You knock. 3 measured raps that echo in the stairwell beyond. Historians still argue whether the rise of boarding houses represented Victorian upward mobility or a symptom of economic desperation. But standing here with your last £5 in your pocket, you're not particularly concerned with historical interpretation. You just need somewhere to sleep that isn't a workhouse dormitory. The door opens to reveal a woman in her 50s, her hair scraped back into a bun so tight it seems to lift her eyebrows. This is Mrs. Thornbury, though you won't dare call her anything but ma'am for at least the first month. She examines you with the assessing gaze of someone who's seen every variety of human desperation parade through her hallway. Can you pay? Will you cause trouble? Are you the sort to skip out on rent or die inconveniently of consumption in one of her rooms? These calculations flash across her face in approximately 3 seconds. References? She asks, her voice carrying that particular London accent that's been gently sanded down by years of managing middle-class lodgers. You hand over your letters, one from your previous employer, another from a vicar who barely remembers you but wrote it anyway for £0.50. She scans them with practiced speed while you stand awkwardly in the doorway, inhaling the boarding house's signature perfume. A complex bouquet of boiled vegetables, coal smoke, carbolic soap, and something musty that might be damp plaster or might just be the accumulated breath of too many people living too close together. Sprinkle in a hint of gas from the wall fixtures, and you've got the smell you'll soon stop noticing entirely. 4 shillings weekly, paid Fridays in advance, Mrs. Thornbury announces, stepping back to let you enter. No followers, no alcohol, no cooking in rooms, breakfast at 7, supper at 6. Church on Sundays is expected, though not compulsory. She rattles off the rules like she's reciting a well-worn script. Because she is. She's probably given this speech twice a week for the past 20 years. You step into the narrow hallway and immediately understand why they call gaslight gaslight. 3 wall-mounted fixtures cast that peculiar yellowish glow that makes everyone look slightly jaundiced and creates shadows that seem to pulse with your heartbeat. It's nothing like the warm steadiness of candlelight or the harsh brightness of the electric lights you've glimpsed in grand hotels. This is the in-between light of the Victorian middle class, cheaper than candles, not quite as dangerous, and casting everything in perpetual twilight even at noon. Here's a fun tidbit. Boarding houses consumed so much gas that companies actually gave landlords special rates, knowing they'd burn fixtures from dawn until the last tenant stumbled upstairs after midnight. Mrs. Thornbury's monthly gas bill probably exceeds what you'll pay her in rent. The hallway stretches back into dimness, with doors on either side and a staircase rising into shadow. You can hear the house's inhabitants even if you can't see them. A cough from behind one door, footsteps creaking overhead, the distant clatter of pots from what must be the kitchen below. Someone's playing a piano badly in a room you can't quite locate. The whole building feels alive, breathing, packed with invisible people living their separate lives in uncomfortable proximity. "Third floor rear," Mrs. Thornbury says, already starting up the stairs without checking if you're following. You heft your carpet bag and climb after, your hand finding the banister worn smooth by countless previous tenants. The stairs narrow as you ascend, and you pass closed doors marked with little brass numbers that are tarnished almost black. Behind 2A, you hear low voices, a man and woman arguing in careful whispers. Behind 2C, nothing but oppressive silence. Welcome home. You'll probably hate it within a week, and feel oddly defensive about it within a month, the way prisoners apparently develop affection for their cells. Mrs. Thornbury doesn't so much walk as patrol, and you quickly realise that nothing happens in this house, without her knowledge. She's been running boarding establishments for 23 years, first as an assistant to her aunt, then inheriting this particular property when her husband conveniently died, and left her with a building but no income. Becoming a boarding house landlady was one of the few respectable ways a Victorian widow could support herself without scandalising society, though respectable is doing some heavy lifting in that sentence. She unlocks the door to your room with one key from a ring holding at least 30 others, each labelled with tiny paper tags in her precise handwriting. This key ring represents her entire kingdom. Every locked door, every storage cupboard, every place a tenant might stash contraband or hide from rent day. She never lets it out of her sight, and you'll swear you can hear it jangling in your dreams within a week. That soft metallic music becomes the soundtrack of boarding house life. Rent book must be signed every Friday before 6 o'clock, she says, pushing open your door. Miss a week and you're out, no exceptions. I've heard every excuse invented by man and several that surprised even me. There's the ghost of a smile on her lips when she says this, quickly suppressed. You get the sense that Mrs. Thornbury has developed a dark sense of humour about human nature after watching it parade through her hallway in various states of desperation. Here's what historians know for certain. Boarding house landladies were some of the shrewdest businesswomen of the Victorian era, managing complex operations that required skills in accounting, property management, food service, and amateur psychology. What doesn't make it into most history books? They also functioned as informal social workers, loan officers, marriage counsellors, and occasionally accomplices in minor crimes. Mrs. Thornbury has probably hidden more than one tenant from creditors and turned a blind eye to contraband bottles she absolutely knew were stashed under floorboards. Your room is, well, it's a room. We'll get to the depressing details in a moment. Right now, Mrs. Thornbury is explaining the house rules in greater detail, and you'd better pay attention because she won't repeat herself, and ignorance won't be accepted as an excuse. Gas turned down at 11 except Saturdays when I allow midnight, she continues. You may burn candles in your room at your own risk, but if you burn down my house, your ghost will still owe me rent. That's definitely a joke, though her expression doesn't change. The water closet is on the landing below. You share it with 7 other tenants, so be considerate. Chamber pots are emptied by the maid-of-all-work before 8. Leave yours outside your door. Hot water for washing is available between 6 and 7 in the morning only. If you miss it, you wash cold. She's rattling through this efficiently, but you notice her eyes doing something interesting, cataloguing every detail about you. Your clothes, your posture, the quality of your carpet bag, whether your hands look like they've done manual labour. She's calculating your staying power, your likelihood of causing drama, your social class pretensions. Scholars still argue whether Victorian landladies were ultimately exploiters of the poor or protectors providing affordable housing, but Mrs. Thornbury seems to occupy some complex middle ground, neither monster nor saint. Breakfast is served between 7 and past, she continues. You're expected to be punctual, dressed, and quiet. This is a respectable house, not a coffee stall. Supper at 6, same rules apply. You're responsible for your own midday meal. There's no dinner service. Laundry is done Mondays, 6pence extra for the service, or you do your own in the scullery when it's available. Church clothes should be presentable on Sundays. No entertaining visitors in your room under any circumstances. No musical instruments after 8 o'clock, and honestly, given the piano playing I'm currently hearing, I should probably ban them entirely. There it is, another almost smile. Mrs. Thornbury runs a tight ship, but she's not completely heartless. You'll learn that she has her favourites, the long-term residents who've earned her grudging respect by paying on time and not causing scandal. She'll extend them credit when times are hard, slip them extra food when they're obviously going hungry, and defend them fiercely if anyone questions their character outside these walls. But cross her, or threaten the house's reputation, and you'll find your belongings on the street faster than you can say breach of contract. The dining room is communal. You'll take meals with the other residents, she says. I expect civil behaviour at table. Religion and politics are not to be discussed. Any romantic entanglements between lodgers must be conducted with appropriate discretion and chaperoning, preferably somewhere other than my property. Her tone suggests this rule gets violated roughly twice a month, and she's exhausted by it. Here's a weird historical tidbit. Some Victorian boarding house landladies actually charged more for rooms facing the street because they were considered more prestigious, even though they were noisier and dirtier from traffic. Mrs. Thornbury's pricing structure includes these strange calculations. Your rear-facing room is cheaper partly because of the location and partly because the previous tenant died there. Not dramatically or anything, just passed away in the night. No one likes to mention it, but the room sat empty for 6 weeks before economic necessity forced Mrs. Thornbury to rent it again at a slight discount. Any questions? Mrs. Thornbury asks, though her tone suggests questions are tolerated rather than encouraged. You shake your head. What would you even ask? Can I survive on 4 shillings a week? Will I make friends or enemies with my fellow lodgers? What happens if I can't pay? She nods, satisfied. Keys are never to be duplicated. Lose yours and it's a 2 shilling replacement fee. I run a clean, quiet, respectable establishment. Keep it that way. She hands you a single iron key, warm from her palm. Welcome to number 47. Then she's gone, her footsteps retreating down the stairs, that keyring jangling like tiny bells. You're alone with your new reality. So here you are, standing in your new home, a space roughly 10 feet by 12 feet that will contain your entire existence for the foreseeable future. Let's start with what you've got. 4 walls covered in wallpaper that was probably fashionable during the Crimean War, now faded to a colour best described as sad beige, with a pattern of roses that look more like cabbage. The paper is peeling near the ceiling in one corner, revealing at least 3 previous layers underneath, like geological strata of poor decorating choices. One narrow window looks out onto the brick wall of the building behind this one, roughly 8 feet away. If you crane your neck hard to the right, you can glimpse a sliver of actual sky, which on clear days provides just enough natural light to see that your room is depressing. The window itself is a sash design that probably hasn't opened smoothly since Victoria took the throne. You'll discover it's painted shut within 10 minutes of trying. The glass is old enough to have that wavy quality that makes the brick wall across from you ripple like it's underwater. Your furniture consists of exactly 6 pieces, and calling some of them furniture is generous. There's an iron bedstead with a mattress that's seen better decades. Historians generally agree that Victorian boarding house mattresses were stuffed with horsehair straw, or occasionally something mysterious that rustled when you moved. This one does all 3, suggesting it's been restuffed multiple times with whatever was cheapest that week. The sheets are clean though, you'll give Mrs. Thornbury that. Thin and worn transparent in places, but clean and smelling of carbolic soap. A washstand lurks in the corner like it's embarrassed to be there. A rickety table holding a ceramic basin and pitcher decorated with faded blue flowers. The pitcher is full of cold water. Remember, hot water is only available between 6 and 7 in the morning, which means your first few weeks here will involve a daily sprint down 2 flights of stairs with your pitcher, fighting through a crowd of other desperate lodgers, trying to catch the hot water before it runs out. It's like a very damp Victorian version of the Hunger Games, except everyone's in their nightclothes and no one makes eye contact. There's a small chest of drawers, 3 drawers, each more reluctant to open than the last. The top drawer has been lined with old newspaper from 1878, which you'll read obsessively when you're bored because entertainment is scarce and you'll take what you can get. The middle drawer sticks completely and you'll never get. It fully opened during your entire tenancy. The bottom drawer opens fine but smells mysteriously of mothballs and ancient regret. A single wooden chair sits by the window, its seat worn smooth by countless previous occupants who sat there staring at that brick wall and contemplating their life choices. You'll spend many evenings in that chair because there's literally nowhere else to sit except the bed, and lying in bed while awake feels too depressingly symbolic of your reduced circumstances, the final piece is a small table, barely large enough for a book and a candle. This will become your desk, dining table, and general surface for the accumulation of your few possessions. Right now, it holds a candlestick. Brass. Tarnished. With a half-burned candle already installed, Mrs. Thornbury provides one candle per week. After that, you're buying your own. Here's a quirky historical detail that doesn't make it into many books. Victorian boarding house rooms typically had marks on the walls where previous tenants had hung pictures, installed makeshift shelves, or driven nails for clothes hooks. Your room has at least 15 nail holes of various sizes scattered across the walls, each one representing someone else's attempt to make this space feel less temporary. Some previous tenant also scratched something into the windowsill that's been painted over, but you can still feel the grooves if you run your fingers across it. You'll never know what it said. The floor is bare boards, gaps visible between them, and you can hear everything happening in the room below. Currently someone's coughing, a deep rattling cough that sounds expensive to treat. The walls aren't much better. You can hear muffled conversation from the room to your left, and what sounds like crying from somewhere to your right, though it might just be the pipes. Victorian houses make the most extraordinary noises, and you'll learn to distinguish between concerning sounds, those are definitely rats in the walls, and normal sounds. That's just the building settling in that way old buildings do, like an elderly person's joints cracking. There's no fireplace in your room. This is a rear third-floor space, which means no chimney access. Heat comes from a single metal grate in the floor connected to the heating system below, and heating system is an optimistic description of whatever Mrs. Thornbury has cobbled together down there. On cold nights, you'll hover over that grate like it's a campfire, and scholars still debate whether the lack of heating in cheaper rooms was economic necessity or deliberate incentive for tenants to spend more time in the communal parlor, where they could be supervised. The ceiling is low enough that if you're tall, you'll develop a permanent defensive hunch. There's a gas fixture mounted on the wall, just one, between the window and the door, with a ceramic shade painted with more of those optimistic roses. The gas cock requires a specific quarter turn that you'll need to master, because turn it too far and it hisses wastefully, not far enough, and you're sitting in darkness. Mrs. Thornbury monitors gas consumption, and will absolutely mention it if you're burning too much. Your door has a lock, which provides a comforting illusion of privacy. But Mrs. Thornbury has a master key, and you'll hear stories about the time she let herself in while Mr. Peterson in 3A was entertaining a cousin who definitely wasn't his cousin. The door also has about a 1/4-inch gap at the bottom, which means light bleeds in from the hallway all night, and you can smell whatever Mrs. Thornbury is cooking approximately 20 minutes before everyone else. One small mirror hangs on the wall by the washstand, spotted and dark around the edges where the silvering has worn away. You'll get used to seeing your reflection looking slightly ghostly and indistinct, like you're already fading into the wallpaper, and that's it. This is your corner of the world now, roughly 120 square feet of Victorian economy living. You set down your carpet bag and sit on the bed, which creaks alarmingly. Through the walls you hear footsteps, conversations, the sound of water being poured, someone laughing. You're alone, but you're never really alone here. Privacy is an expensive luxury, and you definitely can't afford it at 4 shillings a week. The bell shatters your first night's sleep at precisely 6 o'clock in the morning, and you'll quickly learn to hate that sound with a passion you didn't know you possessed. It's not a gentle tinkle or a melodic chime. It's a harsh, clanging brass handbell that Mrs. Thornbury's maid-of-all-work carries through each floor, ringing it with the enthusiasm of someone who's been awake since 5 and wants everyone to share her misery. The girl's name is Elsie, she's about 14, and her morning bell technique can only be described as aggressive. She doesn't just ring it, she performs it, like a one-woman percussion section determined to wake the dead. You jolt upright in bed, disoriented, your breath visible in the frigid air. Because here's something they don't emphasize in romantic Victorian novels. These houses are absolutely freezing in the morning. That heating grate in your floor, it doesn't start working until around 8, after someone down in the basement has spent an hour coaxing the boiler to life. Right now, your room is maybe 45 degrees, and that's being generous. You can see frost forming on the inside of your window. The house immediately erupts into activity around you. Footsteps thunder overhead. Doors open and slam. Someone curses colourfully in the room next door, then catches themselves and mutters an apology to God. You hear the distinctive sound of at least 3 people simultaneously remembering they need the water closet and beginning the morning's first competitive sprint. You need to move fast. The morning routine in a boarding house is a carefully choreographed dance, and newcomers who don't learn the steps quickly get trampled. First priority, the chamber pot situation. Yes, we're talking about this, because chamber pots are an inescapable reality of Victorian boarding house life, and pretending otherwise would be historically dishonest. Your chamber pot lives discreetly under the bed, white ceramic decorated with blue flowers, because apparently Victorians believed human waste containers should be cheerful. The protocol is simple. Use it during the night, place it outside your door before 7 for Elsie to collect and empty, then retrieve it after she's done her rounds. Miss the timing and you're stuck with it until tomorrow, which is exactly as horrible as it sounds. Historians still argue whether the chamber pot system was more hygienic than the alternative of multiple people queuing for a single water closet in the dark, but standing here shivering in your nightshirt, you're not particularly interested in that debate. You do what needs to be done, cover the pot with its lid, and set it outside your door, trying not to make eye contact with the elderly gentleman across the hall who's doing the same thing. There's an unspoken rule that you absolutely do not acknowledge each other during chamber pot placement. It's like everyone temporarily becomes invisible. Victorian dignity requires these little fictions. Now comes the washing situation, which is where things get really fun. That pitcher of water on your washstand. It's cold enough to have a thin skin of ice on top. You break through it with your finger and pour some into the basin, and the shock of that water on your face is enough to make you gasp. This is your wake-up call, more effective than any amount of coffee. You splash your face, your neck, your hands, trying to be thorough while also trying not to prolong the agony. Here's a quirky detail. Some boarding house residents would heat water in their rooms using spirit lamps, which was technically forbidden because of fire risk but widely practiced anyway. You don't have a spirit lamp yet, but you'll probably acquire one within a month because washing in ice water gets old fast, and rules are more like suggestions when your extremities are going numb. The real morning battle is about to begin, the race for the water closet. There's exactly 1 bathroom on this floor, shared among 8 residents. The arithmetic is cruel. 8 people, 1 toilet, everyone needing it at roughly the same time. You pull on your dressing gown and open your door just as the man from 3C sprints past you, his slippers slapping against the floorboards. He reaches the water closet door 3 seconds before you and locks it with an audible click of triumph. You sigh and join the queue that's forming. There's a young woman in a faded pink wrapper who nods at you politely, and an older man who's pretending to read a newspaper while standing in the hallway in his nightshirt, which is a level of Victorian denial that's almost impressive. Nobody speaks. The only sound is the muffled activity from behind the water closet door and the general creaking of the house waking up. The bathroom situation is where boarding house life reveals its true character. Some people are quick and considerate, others are not. You'll learn to identify residents by their bathroom habits. Mr. Peterson in 3A takes approximately forever and emerges looking pleased with himself while everyone else glares daggers. Miss Morrison from 3D is blessedly efficient but leaves the place spotless, which paradoxically makes her take longer. The elderly sisters from 3F share a bathroom visit, which is either touching or disturbing depending on your perspective. Today you're lucky, your wait is only about 8 minutes. When your turn finally comes, you discover the water closet is exactly what you expected. A tiny room barely big enough to turn around in, with a ceramic toilet, a small sink, and wallpaper that's peeling from decades of humidity. There's 1 small window that someone has left open, presumably to air things out, which means the room is roughly the same temperature as the Arctic. The toilet itself is one of those Victorian designs that uses a terrifying amount of water and makes a sound like Niagara Falls when you flush, guaranteeing that everyone in the hallway knows exactly what you've been doing. You handle your business quickly, lingering is considered deeply antisocial when there's a queue, and emerge to find 2 more people waiting. The system works because it has to work. There's no alternative except the chamber pot, and nobody wants to rely on that during waking hours if they can help it. Back in your room, you face the morning's next challenge, getting dressed in a freezing room while maintaining some sense of Victorian modesty. Your clothing is laid out on the chair where you left it last night, and it's so cold that putting it on feels like wrapping yourself in frozen laundry. Scholars continue to debate how Victorian people managed layers of undergarments in these conditions, but the answer is probably quickly and while swearing under their breath. You dress in stages, each layer slightly less horrible than the last. Chemise, drawers, petticoat if you're a woman, or shirt and drawers if you're a man, then the outer layers, each one trapping slightly more body heat, until you're finally, marginally warmer. Your fingers are clumsy with cold as you button and lace and tie. This is why Victorian clothing has so many fasteners. It's a test of manual dexterity under adverse conditions. By the time you're dressed, it's 6:15, and the house has settled into its morning rhythm. You can hear Mrs. Thornbury's voice drifting up from below, giving instructions to Elsie. The smell of something cooking, porridge probably, or kippers, wafts through the gaps around your door. Breakfast is at 7, which gives you about 40 minutes to make yourself presentable, tidy your room, and mentally prepare for your first official meal with your fellow lodgers. Welcome to morning in a Victorian boarding house. It doesn't get easier, you just get faster. You descend the stairs at precisely 7 o'clock, following the sound of clinking cutlery and low conversation. The dining room is on the ground floor just past the front parlour, and you can smell it before you see it. That distinctive aroma of boiled oats, fried fish, and weak tea that will become the olfactory signature of your mornings here. It's not unpleasant exactly, just relentlessly the same, day after day, until you'll be able to identify what Mrs. Thornbury is serving from 2 floors away. The dining room is larger than you expected, dominated by a long table that seats 12 with some creative squeezing. The wallpaper here is a shade of green that probably looked sophisticated in 1870, but now just looks tired. A sideboard along one wall holds the serving dishes, and a single gas lamp chandelier hangs over the table, already lit despite the weak morning sun struggling through the front window. Mrs. Thornbury believes in creating atmosphere even at breakfast, though atmosphere mostly means just bright enough to see your food. Here's where things get interesting. Seating at a boarding house breakfast table is not random. Oh no, there's a hierarchy as rigid as anything you'd find at a royal banquet, except instead of being based on titles and bloodlines, it's based on length of residence, promptness of rent payment, and Mrs. Thornbury's personal favour. You're about to get a crash course in Victorian social stratification, breakfast edition. The head of the table, the spot nearest the fireplace and farthest from the door's draught, belongs to Mr. Whittaker, who's lived here for 7 years and pays his rent so reliably you could set a clock by it. He's already seated, a thin man in his 60s with spectacular sideburns and the posture of someone who takes his status as senior resident very seriously. He nods at you with the bare minimum of acknowledgement required by politeness. Next to him sits Miss Albright, a governess between positions who's been here 3 years. She's the closest thing this house has to aristocracy. Educated, well-spoken, fallen on temporary hard times, but absolutely certain she'll bounce back soon. Her place at the table reflects this delicate balance between respectable background and current poverty. She doesn't acknowledge you at all, which is somehow worse than Mr. Whittaker's minimal nod. The middle seats are occupied by what you'll come to think of as the regulars, long-term residents who've established their territories and defend them with surprising viciousness. There's Mr. Peterson from 3A, the one who takes forever in the bathroom. There's Miss Morrison from 3D, prim and proper and radiating disapproval of basically everything. 2 elderly sisters, the Mrs. Crawford, sit together and communicate in whispers like they're sharing state secrets. And then there's you, directed by Elsie to a seat at the far end of the table, as far from the warmth of the fireplace as physically possible, while still technically being in the same room. This is the newcomer zone, the probationary seating area, where you'll remain until either someone else arrives and bumps you up a spot or you prove yourself worthy of advancement through consistent rent payment and lack of scandal. Sharing your end of the table is a young man who introduces himself as Mr. Davies. Charles, if we're not being formal, which at this end of the table we needn't be. He's got an artist's hands stained with what might be ink or paint, and a slightly manic energy that suggests he hasn't quite adjusted to the boarding house's rigid schedule. He'll become your ally in the coming weeks, mainly because misery loves company, and the far end of the table is definitely miserable. First breakfast, he asks quietly, and you nod. Right. Don't take the last kipper. Don't contradict Miss Albright about anything. And for God's sake, don't mention politics or religion. Oh, and the porridge is always lukewarm. I think she makes it the night before. He's not entirely wrong about that last part. Here's a mainstream historical fact. Victorian boarding houses typically served breakfast from communal pots that had been prepared earlier and kept warm on the stove. The economics of feeding 12 people while maintaining one servant meant everything was made in bulk and served semi-lukewarm at best. You'll learn to arrive exactly at 7 because the food is fractionally warmer then, and by 7:15 everything has achieved room temperature, which in this drafty dining room is barely above Arctic. Elsie begins serving, moving around the table with practiced efficiency. Mr. Whittaker gets served first, naturally, his bowl of porridge arriving with an actual curl of steam rising from it. By the time she reaches your end, the porridge has that distinctive skin on top that tells you it's been sitting just a bit too long. You don't complain. Complaining about food is the fastest way to mark yourself as ungrateful and difficult. The porridge it's porridge. Oats, water, a ghost of salt, and if you're very lucky, a small pitcher of milk to add yourself. Sugar is on the table, but using too much is considered wasteful and lower class. You take a modest spoonful and learn to appreciate porridge for what it is. Warmish calories that will carry you through until the midday meal you'll have to find and pay for yourself. But the real event is the kippers. Historians still argue whether the Victorian obsession with smoked herring at breakfast was nutritional wisdom or simply economic necessity. But regardless, kippers are a boarding house staple. They're salty, fishy, oily, and they'll make your breath smell spectacular for hours afterward. Elsie brings out a platter containing exactly 8 kippers, 1 per adult resident, carefully allocated. The Mrs. Crawford share one between them, which is either touching or economically strategic. This is where breakfast table politics get cutthroat. The kippers at one end of the platter are always slightly larger than the others. Everyone knows this. Everyone pretends not to know this. Mr. Whittaker gets first selection and naturally takes the largest one. The selection proceeds down the table according to the same brutal hierarchy that determines seating, and by the time the platter reaches you, you're looking at the smallest, boniest specimen, the one that's probably more spine than meat. Charles catches your eye and shrugs philosophically. Tuesday they do eggs, he whispers. Not good eggs, mind you, but eggs nonetheless. The tea arrives in a large pot, and here's your quirky historical tidbit. Boarding house tea was legendary for being weak enough to see through. Landladies bought the cheapest tea leaves available and stretched them across multiple servings. This isn't that. Mrs. Thornbury actually provides decent tea, though it's been brewed with that Victorian belief that tea should be strong enough to wake the dead, but diluted enough that the pot serves 12 people. The result is something that's technically tea, but wouldn't satisfy anyone who's ever had a proper cup. Conversation during breakfast is minimal and carefully controlled. Mr. Whittaker reads a newspaper propped against the milk jug, rustling pages with the air of a man performing his morning ritual. Miss Albright discusses the weather with Miss Morrison in tones of crushing boredom. The elderly sisters whisper to each other. Mr. Peterson eats with disturbing intensity, like someone who views breakfast as a competitive sport. You eat your lukewarm porridge, your sad kipper, and drain your weak tea, and you understand that this is your life now. Same table, same hierarchy, same barely warm food every morning at 7 o'clock. The routine is the point. Victorian boarding houses ran on predictability, like ships ran on coal. As you finish, Mrs. Thornbury appears in the doorway, surveying her domain. Her eyes scan the table, checking who's present, who's late, who's eating too much or too little. She catches your eye and gives the tiniest nod. You've successfully navigated your first breakfast without embarrassing yourself. That's something, at least. After breakfast, you discover that you're expected to vacate the dining room promptly, so Elsie can clear the table and reset it for supper. Where you go depends on your daily schedule. If you're employed, you leave for work. If you're between positions, like you currently are, you're faced with the awkward question of how to spend your day without spending money you don't have. The answer, for many residents, is the parlor. The front parlor is Mrs. Thornbury's pride and joy, the room she shows to prospective lodgers to prove that this is indeed a respectable establishment and not some squalid rooming house where people live like animals. It's located on the ground floor right by the front window, and it's been decorated with the kind of Victorian earnestness that prioritizes morality over comfort. Every surface is covered with something: doilies, antimacassars, small ceramic figurines of uncertain origin, and enough potted ferns to qualify as a small forest. The furniture is that particular shade of Victorian brown that makes you think of old churches and serious conversations about character improvement. 2 settees face each other across a low table, There's a selection of mismatched armchairs arranged with geometric precision, and in the corner, looming like a threat, stands an upright piano with yellowed keys and suspicious stains on its bench. That piano is going to become relevant later, and not in a good way. Here's what you need to understand about the parlour. It's communal space, which means it belongs to everyone and therefore to no one, and the rules governing its use are simultaneously rigid and completely unwritten. You're expected to know them instinctively, and heaven help you if you don't. Charles gives you the abbreviated version during your first visit, speaking quietly while pretending to read a 3-day-old newspaper. The chair by the window belongs to Miss Albright between 9 and 11, he murmurs. Don't sit there unless you want a lecture about respect for one's betters. The settee near the fireplace is Mr. Whittaker's territory after supper. The Mrs. Crawford claim the corner near the bookshelf every afternoon at 2, and whatever you do, don't touch the piano unless you actually know how to play it. The parlour operates on a complex system of time-sharing and territorial claims that would impress a lawyer specialising in property disputes. Long-term residents have established their preferred spots and their preferred hours, and newcomers learn to navigate around these invisible boundaries, like sailors avoiding rocks. You can sit anywhere that's not currently claimed, but the moment someone with greater seniority arrives, you're expected to yield gracefully and relocate. Right now, at 8:15 on a Tuesday morning, the parlour is relatively empty. Miss Morrison occupies the chair near the bookshelf, doing needlework with the focus of someone performing surgery. An older gentleman you haven't met yet sits by the fire reading a Bible. And yes, historians confirm that conspicuous Bible reading in boarding house parlours was a recognised method of claiming moral superiority over your fellow residents. It's performative piety, but it works. You settle into one of the less desirable chairs, the one near the door where you'll catch the draft every time someone enters or leaves, and try to look purposeful. This is harder than it sounds. The parlour is meant for respectable leisure activities, reading, needlework, quiet conversation, letter writing. But it's difficult to appear productively occupied when you're actually just killing time until anything happens. The bookshelf offers some salvation. It's stocked with the kinds of books that respectable boarding houses keep on hand to prove their cultural credentials. Well-worn volumes of Dickens, some improving religious texts, a few collections of poetry with suspiciously pristine spines, suggesting no one's ever actually read them, and a complete set of Waverley novels that someone probably donated after a death. You select a volume at random and pretend to read while actually observing the room's social dynamics. Here's a quirky historical fact. Victorian boarding house parlours often featured conversation cards, pre-printed cards with safe discussion topics designed to facilitate polite interaction without risking controversy. Mrs. Thornbury has a box of them on the mantelpiece, though you'll never see anyone actually use them. The mere presence of conversation cards is apparently enough to remind everyone to keep things civil. Miss Morrison finishes a particularly complex stitch and looks up, catching your eye. "You're the new resident in 3E, she states rather than asks. "I hope you'll find our little community agreeable." Little community is doing some heavy diplomatic work in that sentence. This isn't a community, it's a collection of strangers forced into proximity by economic necessity, all pretending they've chosen this arrangement. But you smile and agree that yes, everyone seems very pleasant, and no, you're sure you'll settle in wonderfully. "We maintain standards here," Miss Morrison continues, her needle flashing in and out of the fabric. "Mrs. Thornbury runs a respectable house. I trust you'll help us keep it that way." This is your first direct encounter with the boarding house's self-appointed moral police, and Miss Morrison is clearly the captain. Every boarding house has at least one resident who's taken it upon themselves to monitor everyone else's behaviour and report infractions, real or imagined, to the landlady. Scholars still debate whether these self-appointed enforcers were genuinely concerned with maintaining respectability or just enjoyed the power of surveillance, but the practical effect is the same. You're being watched, evaluated and judged at all times. "Of course," you murmur, because what else can you say? The morning crawls forward. More residents drift in and out, some heading to work, others settling in for their own time-killing sessions. The man with the Bible finishes his chapter and leaves, his moral superiority firmly established for the day. Charles appears around 10, throws himself into a chair with theatrical despair, and announces to no one in particular that he's completely out of inspiration, and might as well become a clerk. "Piano's free," Miss Morrison observes pointedly. Charles visibly shudders. I don't play. Perhaps you should learn. Musical accomplishment is a sign of refinement. This is where things get dangerous. The piano represents the parlour's greatest source of conflict. Victorian culture dictated that musical ability was a marker of gentility and proper upbringing, which meant boarding houses felt obligated to provide pianos. But here's the problem. Most residents can't actually play, or they play badly, or they play the same 3 pieces over and over until everyone else wants to commit violence. Mrs. Thornbury has implemented piano hours, designated times when the instrument may be played without advance permission. These hours are between 4 and 6 in the afternoon, and between 7 and 8 in the evening. Outside these times, you need explicit permission from both Mrs. Thornbury and any residents currently using the parlour. In practice, this means the piano sits silent most of the day, then erupts into cacophony during the designated hours as multiple residents compete for access. The current reigning piano expert is a young woman named Miss Fletcher from the 2nd floor, and when she plays during piano hour, it's actually pleasant. She's competent, plays a good variety of pieces, and doesn't show off excessively. The problem is everyone else who thinks they can play. You'll meet them soon enough. Mr. Peterson, who knows exactly one Chopin nocturne and murders it nightly. Miss Albright's niece during her visits, who's still at the scales and exercises stage, and worst of all, the mysterious tenant in 2B who only plays music hall songs and does so with more enthusiasm than accuracy. I heard someone practicing last night around midnight, Charles says quietly. Sounded like they were strangling cats. Mrs. Thornbury will not be pleased. Miss Morrison's needle pauses mid-stitch. That would be Mr. Henderson. He was warned last week about the noise curfew. There's a glint of satisfaction in her eyes. Henderson has violated the rules, and judgment is coming. The parlour, you're realising, is less a peaceful retreat, and more a stage where the boarding house's social dramas play out in miniature. Every seat carries meaning, every book selection gets evaluated, every conversation gets monitored. You can't relax here, not really. You can only perform the role of respectable lodger, and hope you don't make any mistakes that will get reported to Mrs. Thornbury and entered into the permanent record of your character. By 11 o'clock, you've had enough enforced leisure for one morning. You retreat to your room, where at least the only person judging you is yourself. Friday arrives with the inevitability of doom, and with it comes the ritual that defines boarding house existence: rent day. You've had exactly 1 week to settle in, 1 week to pretend this is all temporary, and now Mrs. Thornbury's ledger is about to make everything uncomfortably real. 4 shillings doesn't sound like much until you're counting out your coins on Thursday night, and realising you've got 4 shillings and 3pence to your name, with no job lined up and no idea where your next income is coming from. The rent collection happens between 4 and 6 o'clock, and Mrs. Thornbury conducts it with the efficiency of a military operation. She sets up in the dining room, ledger open on the table, a small cash box at her elbow, and that expression on her face that suggests she's heard every excuse invented by desperate humanity, and several that surprised even her. You can hear her from 2 floors up. The soft knock on each door, the murmur of voices, the rustle of coins, the scratch of her pen in the ledger. Here's your mainstream historical fact. Victorian boarding house landladies were legally entitled to seize and sell a tenant's possessions if rent went unpaid, and they could do so with remarkably little legal oversight. That cash box isn't just for storing money. It's a symbol of Mrs. Thornbury's power over every person in this house. Pay up or get out, and getting out might mean leaving your belongings behind to cover the debt. You can track rent collection's progress through the house by sound alone. It starts on the ground floor and works upward, which means the anxiety builds as you wait. You hear Mr. Whittaker's door on the 2nd floor. Knock, open, a brief exchange, the clink of coins that sounds confident and substantial, the satisfied scratch of pen on paper. Mr. Whittaker pays in gold sovereigns when he can, just to make a point about his financial stability. The door closes. Mrs. Thornbury's footsteps continue down the hall. Miss Albright's transaction takes longer. You hear negotiation in those muffled voices, though you can't make out words. Miss Albright is a penny pincher of epic proportions, and she'll argue about every farthing if she thinks there's an accounting error. The conversation extends for 3 full minutes before you hear the decisive clink of payment and the door closing. Mrs. Thornbury's footsteps sound slightly heavier, like that interaction aged her a year. Then comes a different sound. A knock, a long pause, another knock. A door opening slowly. Someone asking for more time. Mrs. Thornbury's voice rises just enough that you catch the phrase, "Said that last week, Mr. Henderson," and you know Henderson's in trouble. There's a quality to begging for a rent extension that's audible even through walls and floors, a desperation that makes everyone else in the house uncomfortable, because we're all closer to that edge than we'd like to admit. Charles appears at your door around 5, looking grim. "Got your rent ready?" You nod, though ready is generous. You've got exactly 4 shillings, which means you've got nothing left for the rest of the week. No money for your midday meals, no money for omnibus fare if you need to travel for job interviews, no money for anything except the basic shelter and 2 meals a day that your rent payment guarantees. "Henderson's getting evicted," Charles says quietly. "Heard it from Miss Morrison, who heard it from Elsie, who heard Mrs. Thornbury telling him he has until tomorrow morning, 3 weeks behind apparently, tried to pay with a promissory note." He shakes his head at the audacity. Promissory notes in a boarding house? That's like bringing a handwritten IOU to a shopkeeper. It displays a fundamental misunderstanding of how power works in this establishment. Here's a quirky historical tidbit that illuminates the brutal economics. Some Victorian boarding house landladies actually preferred a certain rate of tenant turnover because they could charge new residents a key deposit or cleaning fee that effectively gave them an extra week's rent for the same room. Mrs. Thornbury doesn't engage in such obvious profiteering, but the practice was common enough that guidebooks warned prospective lodgers about it. The footsteps reach your floor around 5:45. You hear her working through the other rooms. Miss Morrison pays precisely and probably keeps her own ledger to cross-reference against Mrs. Thornbury's. The Misses Crawford pay together, counting out their coins in twin whispers. Mr. Peterson's transaction involves some kind of discussion that you can't quite hear, but that sounds vaguely argumentative. Then she's at your door. 3 measured knocks. You open it to find Mrs. Thornbury looking exactly as you expected. Tired, professional, and wielding that ledger like a weapon. 4 shillings for the week, ending the 22nd, she says, which is technically a question but sounds like a statement. You hand over your coins, carefully counted into her palm. She examines them with a practiced eye, making sure they're genuine, checking they're not clipped or filed down, evaluating their weight. This is why boarding house landladies and shopkeepers developed such expertise in numismatics. Counterfeit and degraded coinage was common enough that accepting payment required vigilance. "Settled," she pronounces, making a check mark in her ledger next to your name. You glimpse the page briefly. It's ruled into columns showing name, room number, rent due, rent paid, and a notes section where she's written things like prompt, or late, warned, or, in one case, watch carefully. You don't see what's written next to your name, but you hope it's something neutral. "Finding employment?" she asks, not unkindly. This is the question behind the question. Can you continue paying, or are you going to become another Henderson situation? "Prospects are promising," you lie smoothly, because what else can you say? "I'm hopeful by next week." She nods, accepts this obvious fabrication with the grace of someone who's heard it 1,000 times, and moves on to Charles's door. You close yours and lean against it, feeling the relief of having survived another rent day combined with the anxiety of knowing you've got 7 days to somehow acquire 4 more shillings, or you'll be the one begging for extensions. The sound of rent collection continues. Doors opening and closing, coins clinking, Mrs. Thornbury's steady footsteps, and occasionally the awful silence that means someone's negotiating for time they probably won't get. Scholars still debate whether Victorian boarding houses were exploitative poverty traps or essential social safety nets, and the answer probably depends on whether you're looking at it from Mrs. Thornbury's perspective or from the perspective of the person who's just handed over their last 4 shillings. By 6 o'clock it's done. Mrs. Thornbury descends to her private quarters with her ledger and cash box, and the house collectively exhales. Some people paid easily, some paid with difficulty. And somewhere on the 2nd floor, Henderson is probably packing his carpet bag, knowing that tomorrow morning he'll be out on the street with nowhere obvious to go, and another black mark against his character that will make finding a new place harder. Friday nights in a boarding house have a peculiar atmosphere. Relief mixed with dread. The comfort of having shelter for another week combined with the knowledge that this whole performance repeats in 7 days. You're not building toward anything. You're just surviving week by week 4 shillings at a time. That evening at supper, Henderson's seat is conspicuously empty. No one mentions it. That's the unspoken rule. We don't talk about the people who disappear. It could be any of us next week. Now that you've survived your first week, it's time to properly meet the cast of characters who populate number 47 Marchmont Street. Because a boarding house isn't just a building, it's a peculiar ecosystem where people from wildly different backgrounds get compressed into uncomfortable proximity and forced to perform civility while quietly judging each other's life choices. Let's start with Mr. Whittaker, the senior resident who's occupied that prime seat at the breakfast table for 7 years. He's a clerk at a legal firm in the city, one of those jobs that sounded promising 30 years ago when he started but never quite delivered on its implicit promises of advancement. Now he's in his 60s, still shuffling papers and copying documents while younger men leap past him up the ladder. He wears the same black suit every day, well brushed, carefully maintained, increasingly shiny at the elbows, and he projects an air of faded dignity that's both touching and slightly depressing. Whittaker is the unofficial mayor of the boarding house, a position he's earned through sheer stubborn longevity. He knows every house rule, every territorial claim, every bit of gossip from the past 7 years. New residents come to him with questions, and he dispenses advice with the gravity of a judge pronouncing sentence. He's not particularly warm, but he's reliable, and in a boarding house, reliability is worth more than charm. Then there's Miss Albright, the governess between positions, which is Victorian code for currently unemployed but too genteel to admit it. She's in her early 30s, educated at a respectable ladies' academy, and living on the thin edge of middle-class respectability that could shatter at any moment. She takes tea in the parlor every afternoon at 3 o'clock precisely, her posture perfect, her needlework impeccable, desperately performing the role of someone who's only temporarily inconvenienced by circumstances. Here's your mainstream historical fact. Governess was one of the few acceptable occupations for educated middle-class women who needed to support themselves. But it was precarious work. You lived in someone else's home, you were neither family nor servant, and positions ended without warning when children grew up or families relocated. Miss Albright has been between positions for 8 months now, and everyone's too polite to ask questions. But the anxiety radiating from her is almost visible. The real entertainment value comes from Mr. Peterson in 3A, the man who monopolizes the bathroom and plays Chopin badly. He's a travelling salesman for a patent medicine company, which means he's gone for weeks at a time, and then suddenly reappears with suspicious enthusiasm and cash that disappears within days. He's probably in his 40s, though it's hard to tell because he's got that weathered look of someone who lives primarily on confidence and cheap whiskey. He tells elaborate stories about his sales territories and important clients, and everyone nods politely while mentally calculating how much of it is fiction. Peterson is the boarding house rake, if you can be a rake when you're middle-aged and selling dubious stomach tonics. He definitely entertains cousins in his room despite the strict no visitors rule, and you've heard that Mrs. Thornbury caught him once but lets it slide because he pays rent on time when he's in town. There's something almost admirable about his complete shamelessness. He breaks rules with such audacity that enforcing them seems petty. Miss Morrison, your breakfast time inquisitor, deserves special mention. She's a seamstress, works from her room, taking in alterations and custom orders, and has perfected the art of being physically present in every communal space, while somehow making everyone wish she wasn't. She's the boarding house's moral enforcer, the one who notices when you come home 5 minutes after curfew, who comments on how much tea you're drinking, who questions whether that book you're reading is appropriate. Historians still argue whether characters like Miss Morrison were genuinely concerned with maintaining standards or whether surveillance gave meaning to otherwise tedious lives, but frankly, her motivation matters less than the exhausting reality of being constantly observed. The Mrs. Crawford, elderly twin sisters occupying 3F, are the boarding house's permanent fixtures, having lived here for 16 years. They're in their 70s now, dressed identically in black bombazine that went out of style during the Crimean War, and they communicate primarily through whispers and significant glances. Nobody knows exactly what their financial situation is, though there are theories ranging from small inheritance to embezzlement decades ago. They're harmless mostly, though their constant whispering creates an atmosphere of conspiracy, even when they're probably just discussing the weather. Charles Davies, your ally at the far end of the breakfast table, is an aspiring writer who supports himself through copying work and the occasional paid article. He's got ink permanently stained into his fingers, a collection of rejection letters he treats like medals, and the kind of desperate optimism that hasn't yet been beaten out of him by reality. He's 24, which makes him young enough to still believe things will improve and old enough to start suspecting they won't. You'll become friends mostly through shared poverty and complementary cynicism. And then there's Miss Fletcher from the second floor, the one who can actually play the piano. She's a music teacher, gives lessons in various middle-class homes around London, and maintains the kind of cheerful competence that makes everyone else feel vaguely inadequate. She's pleasant, professional, and suspiciously well-adjusted for someone living in a boarding house, which makes some of the other residents, looking at you, Miss Morrison, deeply suspicious of her. Surely no one genuinely happy would choose to live here, which means she must be hiding something. She's not. Some people are just good at making the best of difficult circumstances, but try explaining that to Miss Morrison. Here's a quirky historical tidbit. Victorian boarding houses often developed their own internal social structures that mimicked the class hierarchies outside, but scrambled them in interesting ways. An impoverished gentlewoman like Miss Albright might outrank a prosperous tradesman in social status, but have less actual power than someone like Mr. Whittaker, who paid reliably and had seniority. There are other residents you'll meet more gradually. The mysterious gentleman in 2B who leaves for work before dawn and returns after supper, never socializing. The young woman in 2D whose occupation nobody's quite figured out, but who receives a lot of carefully wrapped packages. The elderly man on the ground floor who's recovering from something and rarely leaves his room. Each has their story, their secrets, their reasons for ending up here. Living with these people means learning, their rhythms, their habits, their quirks and trigger points. You'll memorize Mr. Whittaker's snore pattern from 2 floors away. You'll recognize Peterson's footsteps stumbling up the stairs after a night out. You'll know Miss Morrison is having a bad day when her needlework becomes especially aggressive. These strangers are becoming your peculiar dysfunctional family, bound together not by affection, but by shared address and economic necessity. Welcome to the neighbourhood. Try not to make enemies, because you'll be seeing these faces every single day, possibly for years. Here's something the boarding house advertisements don't mention. You only get 2 meals a day for your 4 shillings, and neither of them is lunch. Breakfast at 7 and supper at 6, that's what Mrs. Thornbury provides. The midday meal is your own problem, and how you solve that problem tells everyone exactly where you stand in the boarding house hierarchy. Most residents leave for their midday meal. Mr. Whittaker walks to a chop house near his office, where he can get a decent plate of meat and potatoes for 6pence. Miss Fletcher takes her lunch at whichever household she's teaching in that day, often the best meal she eats all week, because middle-class families trying to impress the music teacher will actually serve fresh bread and real butter. Peterson, when he's in town, haunts pubs and eats dubious pies while conducting what he calls business meetings, and everyone else calls drinking before noon. The people who stay, that's where you see the real poverty. You, Charles, the Mrs. Crawford, and usually a rotating cast of whoever's particularly broke that week. You drift down to the dining room around 1 o'clock to find Elsie has laid out the remains of breakfast, and whatever else Mrs. Thornbury has decided constitutes cold dinner. And when they say cold, they mean it literally. Nothing is heated, nothing is freshly prepared. This is yesterday's supper reincarnated, last night's leftovers given a second chance at being eaten. Today it's mutton, or what remains of Monday's mutton after it's been served hot once, carved for sandwiches, and now appears in its final form as cold grey slices arranged on a platter with the enthusiasm of a funeral. There's also bread, marginally fresher than the meat but not by much, and a pot of something that might be pickle or might be chutney. The label has worn off the jar and nobody's brave enough to ask. Here's your mainstream historical fact. Victorian boarding houses rarely included lunch in the standard rate because most lodgers were employed and ate near their workplaces. The cold dinner option was essentially a charitable afterthought, using leftovers that would otherwise be wasted. Mrs. Thornbury isn't being cruel. She's actually being relatively generous by offering anything at all. Some boarding houses charged extra for midday food access. You sit at the long table that feels enormous now with only 4 people, scattered along its length. The Mrs. Crawford occupy their usual spots, whispering over their shared plate of mutton. Charles slumps in his chair, staring at the food with the expression of someone who's eaten this exact meal too many times to count. You take your seat at the far end. The hierarchy persists even when most of the hierarchy is absent, and contemplate your options. The economics of the midday meal reveal themselves through brutal arithmetic. If you eat out, you're spending at minimum 4pence for something barely adequate, 6pence for something decent, That's £1 or more per week just for lunch, on top of your £4 rent. For someone employed at 30 shillings a week, it's manageable. For someone unemployed with exactly 4 shillings and 3p to their name, that would be you, it's impossible. So you eat cold mutton and feel grateful Mrs. Thornbury provides even this. I've been thinking of writing a novel set in a boarding house, Charles announces to the room at large, sawing at his mutton with a knife that's seen better years. But I'm concerned it would be too depressing to sell, the Mrs. Crawford twitter quietly. You can't tell if they're amused or offended or both. You could make it romantic, you suggest, spreading pickle or chutney on your bread. Tragic lovers kept apart by strict landlady rules. Already been done. Besides, Mrs. Thornbury would have me evicted for defamation of character. He takes a bite, chews thoughtfully. This mutton has achieved a texture I didn't know was possible. It's simultaneously dry and slimy. He's not wrong. Victorian cold meat has qualities that modern refrigeration has thankfully rendered obsolete. This mutton has been sitting in the larder since yesterday evening, protected from flies by nothing more than cheesecloth and prayer. It's safe to eat? Probably. But safe and pleasant are very different standards. Here's your quirky historical tidbit. Some Victorian boarding houses actually had lunch clubs, where residents who stayed for the midday meal would pool money to buy something better than leftovers. They'd send someone out to fetch pies or fish from a street vendor, splitting the cost. Mrs. Thornbury doesn't permit this because it implies her provided food is inadequate, which it absolutely is, but acknowledging it would damage her professional pride. The silence stretches out. Unlike breakfast and supper with their forced sociability, the cold dinner crowd doesn't pretend to enjoy each other's company. You're united only by shared financial desperation, which isn't much of a foundation for conversation. You eat mechanically, consuming calories without pleasure, trying not to think about the chop house meals happening elsewhere in London right now. Miss Morrison appears briefly, surveys the sad scene, and retreats without taking food. She's employed as a seamstress, and presumably eats while she works, pins in her mouth and judgment in her heart's hesitation, and he is far more patient than you are stubborn. Above all, let the complete story of Lucifer teach you to stop expecting neutrality from your own soul. There is no middle kingdom, no safe zone where you can stay unaligned, no private country where you get to be your own harmless little god. You're either slowly, quietly becoming more like the rebel angel, or more like the obedient son, and the line between those two is not drawn by how spiritual you feel, but by who gets the last word over your choices. The good news tucked into all the heaviness is that if you belong to Jesus, the last word over you has already been spoken, and it is not lost, or mine, or damned. It is loved, forgiven, kept, and even Lucifer, for all his rage and history and intelligence, cannot rewrite a verdict he did not issue. He can snarl at you, lie to you, bait you, accuse you, but he cannot climb back into heaven and erase what was written there with nails and thorns. And if you can remember that on your worst days, then his story will never be anything more in your life than what God intends it to be. A cautionary shadow that throws the shape of the cross into sharper light. A dark road you glimpse just long enough to say, with all your heart, not that way, not for me, I know where it ends, before turning your face again toward the only throne in this universe that ever deserved to be sat on, and the only king who ever proved with his own blood that having you with him forever was worth enduring every last blow the rebel could muster. If you strip away all the fire and symbols and just listen underneath, the story that started with Lucifer is really a story about what you believe will make you safe, because that's what he wanted in a twisted way. To never be vulnerable, never be below, never be at the mercy of anyone else's will, and the more he chased that, the less safe he became, until all he had left was his own hard refusal and a universe that would not bend for him. You know that feeling in miniature every time you tighten up around something, an outcome, a relationship, a plan, and decide deep inside, even if you never say it, I have to control this or I'll fall apart. And then the more you clench, the more anxious and brittle you get, the more every small disruption feels like a threat, the more the world feels like an enemy. That's Lucifer's gravity pulling at you. That same refusal to trust anyone else's hands, and if you live there long enough, it reshapes you. Not all at once, but slowly, like a face set into a permanent scowl. God tells his story not just to scare you, but to show you where that road goes if nobody stops you, if no one pries your fingers off the things you're gripping like a throne, and then, in the same breath, He offers you something Lucifer never got: a safe place to unclench, a person strong enough that you can actually hand things over without. Monday arrives with the special dread reserved for laundry day, and if you thought breakfast table politics were complicated, you're about to discover that competing for hot water and drying space makes breakfast look like a peaceful diplomatic summit. The entire boarding house transforms into a steamy, chaotic battleground, where normally civilized people become territorial animals, protecting their washing rights with surprising ferocity. Mrs. Thornbury runs laundry with military precision, which is the only thing preventing complete anarchy. The copper, a large built-in boiler in the scullery, gets fired up at 5 in the morning, and by 6 o'clock there's hot water available for washing. The catch: there's 1 copper, 1 scullery sink, 1 mangle for wringing, and 12 residents who all need clean clothes. The mathematics are brutal, and the competition is ruthless. You learn the system through trial and catastrophic error. Your first Monday, you innocently wander down to the scullery around 9 o'clock with your basket of dirty linens, thinking you'll just pop them in for a quick wash. You find Miss Morrison already there, sleeves rolled up, aggressively scrubbing something in the sink with a bar of carbolic soap that could double as a weapon. Behind her, Miss Fletcher is feeding sheets through the mangle, which makes an ominous creaking sound with each rotation. The Misses Crawford are hovering by the copper, guarding their boiling delicates like dragons protecting gold. "You'll need to wait," Miss Morrison says without looking up. "I've got the sink for another 20 minutes, then Miss Fletcher has reserved it. You can take a slot after 11 if you'd like to sign up." She nods toward a slate on the wall where someone's drawn a schedule in chalk with time slots that look suspiciously like booking a surgery appointment. Here's your mainstream historical fact. Victorian laundry was genuinely backbreaking labour that could take an entire day for a household's worth of washing. The process involved heating water, soaking clothes, scrubbing with harsh soap, boiling whites, wringing by hand or mangle, and then drying everything, all without modern machinery. Boarding houses with 12 residents produced an astonishing amount of dirty linen per week, and managing it without dedicated laundry staff was a logistical nightmare. You sign up for the 11 o'clock slot and retreat, but Charles catches you in the hallway. First laundry day? Is it always like this? Worse, usually. The Crawford sisters got there early today, so they're in good moods. Last week, Miss Morrison and Mrs. Peterson from 2D nearly came to blows over whose turn it was at the copper. He grins at your expression. "Welcome to Monday. Hope you didn't have any plans." The thing about boarding house laundry is that you can't just send it out to a commercial laundry like wealthier people do. That costs money. 6p for a bundle, which is beyond your current budget. Mrs. Thornbury offers washing service for 6p extra per week, but that's also an impossible luxury, so you do it yourself, joining the Monday morning scrum of residents trying to transform dirty clothes into clean ones, using shared facilities and limited resources. Your 11 o'clock slot arrives, and you claim the sink with the victory of someone who's just won a significant battle. The water's barely warm by now, you're 6th in the rotation, and the copper's heat is fading, but it's water and it's wet and you've got soap. You set to scrubbing your collars, your cuffs, your shirt fronts, working the soap in with your knuckles until they're raw. Victorian laundry soap is basically weaponized lye, and if you're not careful, it'll take the skin right off your hands along with the dirt. Here's where things get interesting: the drying situation. There's a washing line in the back courtyard that everyone shares, and there's also racks in the scullery for winter drying. But there's nowhere near enough space for everyone's washing, which means whoever finishes first gets the best spots, and everyone else makes do with cramped corners or, God help you, trying to dry things in your room, which leads to damp problems that Mrs. Thornbury absolutely prohibits. You wring your clothes through the mangle, a process that requires surprising upper body strength and constant vigilance to keep your fingers from getting caught in the rollers. Miss Albright occupies the mangle after you, her face set in lines of grim determination as she feeds through what looks like an entire trousseau's worth of petticoats. You catch a glimpse of the stitching on them and realise she's hand-embroidered every single garment, probably during those endless afternoons in the parlour. It's touching and depressing in equal measure, all that beautiful needlework on undergarments nobody sees, performing gentility even in poverty. You haul your wrung-out washing to the courtyard and discover that every good spot on the line is already taken. The sunny spots where things actually dry, claimed. The positions with good air circulation, occupied. You're left wedging your items into the shadowy corner where they'll take twice as long to dry, and probably acquire that characteristic musty smell of things that dried too slowly. And then comes the moment every boarding house resident dreads. You're hanging up your stockings when you notice you've only got 3. You brought 4 down to wash. Where's the 4th? This is how laundry day accusations begin. Historians still argue whether Victorian boarding house theft was as common as residents claimed, or whether items simply got mixed up in the communal chaos. But standing here, staring at your incomplete set of stockings, you understand the paranoia. Did someone take it? Did it fall behind something? Is Miss Morrison even now absconding with your personal hosiery, for reasons you can't fathom but wouldn't put past her? You search the scullery, checking under sinks and behind the copper. You interrogate your memory. Did you bring 4 or 3? You were sure it was 4, but maybe it was 3 and you're just confused. The uncertainty is maddening. Do you accuse someone? Do you let it go? Victorian boarding house etiquette provides no clear guidance on appropriate stocking theft confrontation protocols. Charles appears, his own laundry dripping miserably from inferior line positions. Lost something? Maybe a stocking, maybe I'm losing my mind. Both are equally likely on Mondays. Last month I lost 2 handkerchiefs and an undershirt. Never found them. Miss Morrison suggested I was careless. I suggested perhaps there's a linen thief operating in the house. We haven't spoken civilly since. Here's your quirky historical tidbit. Some Victorian boarding houses actually had laundry marks, unique embroidered or inked symbols residents put on their linens to prevent mix-ups. It was like medieval heraldry, but for undergarments, and it worked surprisingly well until people got too lazy to mark every item properly. The afternoon wears on, the scullery becoming increasingly humid and soapy and tense. Someone starched their collars in the shared starch solution, making it too thick for everyone else. Someone else has left the mangle mechanism too tight, and now it's grinding ominously. The Mrs. Crawford have hung what appears to be 87 identical black stockings on the line, creating a forest of funereal hosiery that blocks light from everyone else's washing. By 5 o'clock, you're exhausted, damp, missing a stocking, and your clothes are still nowhere near dry. Mrs. Thornbury appears to announce that the scullery must be cleared by 6 for supper preparations, which means you'll need to move everything still drying into your room. Rules be damned! You'll spend tonight with wet laundry draped over every available surface, your room achieving a humidity level normally found in tropical rainforests. This is Monday, every single week, forever. Or at least until you can afford to pay someone else to do your washing, which at your current financial trajectory will be approximately never. There's a door at the back of the ground floor hallway that you're never supposed to notice, let alone open. It's always closed, it's dark wood blending into the dark wallpaper, and it leads to Mrs. Thornbury's private quarters, the section of the house that's hers alone, the space where she retreats from her role as landlady, and becomes simply a person living in her own home. Except it's not entirely her own home anymore, is it? She's carved out a private corner in a building she's had to convert into shared space just to survive, and that tension defines everything about her existence. You catch glimpses, though. Everyone does. The door opens occasionally when she's bringing up supplies from the cellar, or when Elsie needs instructions, and in those brief moments you see tantalizing hints of another world. There's a sitting room beyond that door. You can make out the edge of a faded sofa, a fireplace that's actually lit during the day, luxury, and wallpaper that hasn't been destroyed by decades of different tenants. It looks comfortable in a way the rest of the house never could be, because it's not performing respectability for paying guests. It's just a room where someone lives. Here's what most people don't understand about Victorian boarding house landladies. They're living in a state of permanent performance, playing the role of stern authority figure for strangers who've colonised their homes. Mrs. Thornbury didn't want 12 lodgers. She wanted her husband not to die and leave her with a house and no income. She wanted to remain a respectable middle-class wife with her own household and her own privacy. Instead, she got economic necessity dressed up as entrepreneurship, and she's been making the best of it for 23 years. The first time you see behind the curtain, really see, happens by accident 2 weeks into your residence. You're heading to the scullery early one morning when you hear voices from behind the forbidden door, which is standing slightly ajar. Mrs. Thornbury is talking to someone, her voice softer than you've ever heard it upstairs. You shouldn't eavesdrop. You absolutely know you shouldn't eavesdrop. But you pause anyway, and through the gap you catch a glimpse of an entirely different Mrs. Thornbury. She's sitting at a small table with a woman who must be her sister. They've got the same nose, the same way of holding their shoulders, They're having tea, actual good tea from the smell of it, not the weak boarding house variety. There's cake on a plate between them, real cake with icing. Mrs. Thornbury is laughing at something, a genuine laugh that transforms her entire face, and for a moment she looks 20 years younger and infinitely less exhausted. Then Elsie appears behind you with a basket of vegetables and you have to move, and the moment's gone. But you've seen it now. The person behind the landlady, the woman who has her own life and her own relationships that have nothing to do with managing difficult lodgers and collecting rent. It's humanizing and somehow makes everything more depressing, because it means she's just as trapped by circumstance as the rest of you. Only she's trapped in her own former home, watching strangers live in rooms that used to have different purposes. Historians still argue whether female boarding house keepers were empowered businesswomen or victims of Victorian economic restrictions that left widows with few viable options for self-support. Mrs. Thornbury is probably both. She's running a successful business, but she's doing it because the alternative was destitution, and success means living surrounded by strangers in the house she once shared only with her husband. Charles has a theory that Mrs. Thornbury's private quarters are actually quite grand, that she's sequestered all the good furniture and decent fixtures down there while giving lodgers the shabby cast-offs. He's probably half right. You see better quality items sometimes when that door opens, a proper carpet, not threadbare runner, a mirror with actual silver backing, not the spotted disasters upstairs, a clock that looks like it might have been a wedding gift, something with sentimental rather than functional value. But here's your quirky historical fact. Many boarding house landladies actually lived in worse conditions than their lodgers because they'd allocated all the good rooms for rent to maximise income. Mrs. Thornbury might have a sitting room, but she's probably sleeping in what used to be a butler's pantry or storage room, the least rentable space in the building. The comfortable sofa you glimpsed might be sharing space with her business records, supplies, and the infrastructure required to run a 12-person household. Elsie provides most of your intelligence about the forbidden zone. She's the only person besides Mrs. Thornbury who regularly crosses that threshold, and she's 14, which means she hasn't yet learned to keep her observations to herself. Over cold dinners when you're both stuck in the dining room, you because you're broke, her because she's taking a break from duties, she shares details. She's got photographs all over the walls down there, Elsie says one afternoon, picking at leftover potato. Of him, her husband, I mean. He was handsome, had a big moustache. Died of pneumonia, she told me once. There's one picture, their wedding day, and she's so young in it. Probably my age. Strange to think she was ever my age. You ask what else is down there, and Elsie describes a narrow bedroom, a small office where Mrs. Thornbury does her accounts, and a tiny kitchen separate from the main scullery where she can cook her own meals without having to coordinate with feeding 12 lodgers. It sounds cramped, private, and infinitely precious. A small kingdom carved out of necessity, maintained through constant vigilance. You see Mrs. Thornbury emerge from her quarters every morning around 6:30, her face already set in landlady expression, her keys jangling at her waist. She's put on her public self along with her dress, and she won't take it off again until she retreats through that door in the evening, probably around 10 o'clock after everyone's settled for the night. That's 16 hours a day of being Mrs. Thornbury the landlady, and maybe 6 hours of being whoever she actually is underneath. Sometimes late at night, you hear music from below, a music box playing something slow and melancholy. It stops after a few minutes, like she's caught herself indulging in nostalgia and forced herself to be practical again. The sound drifts up through the heating grate in your floor, this small evidence of private grief or private joy, you can't tell which. The forbidden zone reminds you that everyone in this house is performing a role, even the person who seems most in control. Mrs. Thornbury plays the stern landlady, Mr. Whittaker plays the respectable senior clerk, Miss Albright plays the temporarily inconvenienced governess, and you play the person who definitely has prospects and isn't at all terrified about next week's rent. Behind all the performances are actual humans with actual lives, and sometimes, if you're paying attention, you catch glimpses of them through accidentally opened doors. 6 o'clock brings the bell again, Elsie's second daily performance, though evening bell ringing has less aggression and more resignation, like she's as tired of the routine as everyone else. But this bell matters more than the morning one, because supper is the boarding house's main event, the social centrepiece of the day, and attendance is not optional. Miss it and you've wasted part of your rent payment. Miss it repeatedly, and Mrs. Thornbury will have questions about your character and your whereabouts. You descend to the dining room to find it transformed from the cold dinner desolation you witnessed earlier. The table's been properly set with mismatched plates that at least make an effort to look presentable. The gas lights are all burning, creating a warm glow that almost makes the faded wallpaper look intentional. Steam rises from serving dishes on the sideboard, and the smell is actually appealing. Tonight it's some kind of stew, probably beef, with potatoes and what might be carrots. After cold mutton, this smells like a feast. Everyone's here. That's the rule. Supper is communal and mandatory. The full cast of boarding house characters assembles around the table in their designated spots. The hierarchy you learned at breakfast reasserting itself. Mr. Whittaker at the head, closest to the fire and the warmth. Miss Albright at his right hand, her posture perfect despite the long day. Miss Morrison across from her, already scanning the table for infractions of etiquette or good taste. The Misses Crawford in their coordinated seats, matching black dresses freshly laundered from this morning's chaos. Mr. Peterson, back from whatever he does during the day, looking slightly drunk and very pleased with himself. And there's you and Charles at the far end, the probationary zone, where at least you can exchange glances when things get ridiculous. Orchestrated narrative elements, dialogue, dynamics, tensions. Good start. Now I need to describe the serving process, the food quality, and the social dynamics. I should include some dialogue, describe the conversations that happen or don't happen, and show the tensions and personalities coming through during the meal. Mrs. Thornbury presides from a standing position near the sideboard, overseeing service with the attention of a general reviewing troops. Elsie serves, working her way down the hierarchy from most important to least, and you've learned to accept that your stew will be slightly cooler and have fewer visible chunks of meat than Mr. Whittaker's portion. That's just how boarding house mathematics work. The best bits go to the people who've earned them through seniority and consistent payment. Here's your mainstream historical fact. Victorian boarding houses typically served their main meal in the evening because most residents were employed during the day. This supper was usually the only hot, substantial meal included in the basic rent, making it both a nutritional necessity and a forced social gathering that landladies use to monitor their lodgers' behaviour and associations. The stew, when it arrives at your end of the table, is actually decent. Mrs. Thornbury is a competent if uninspired cook, and she understands that feeding 12 people adequately is what keeps them paying rent. The beef is tough, but present. The potatoes are cooked through. The gravy has actual flavour, probably from liberal use of beef drippings and salt. There's bread too, not fresh. Probably yesterday's from a bakery that sells day-old loaves cheap, but slathered with margarine it's perfectly acceptable. Lovely weather we've been having, Miss Albright announces to no one in particular, which is the Victorian middle-class way of saying, I will now initiate mandatory polite conversation. Mr. Whittaker makes an agreeable noise while chewing. The weather is always a safe topic. The conversational equivalent of beige wallpaper. Completely inoffensive and utterly boring. Though I do think rain is forecast for tomorrow, Miss Morrison adds, because of course she does. Miss Morrison's special talent is taking any pleasant observation and finding its cloud lining. The Misses Crawford whisper to each other, probably agreeing about the rain, or possibly discussing something completely unrelated. Their private conversation runs parallel to the table's public one, a separate channel of communication that's been going on for 16 years and shows no signs of stopping. Here's where supper becomes interesting, or at least as interesting as forced communal dining can be. The conversation rules are strict. No religion, no politics, no contentious topics whatsoever. But humans being humans, people find ways to be contentious about the weather, about bread quality, about whether the stew has enough salt. Tiny disagreements blow up into significant tensions because you're seeing these same people 3 times a day, every day, and familiarity breeds not contempt exactly, but a low-level irritation that occasionally erupts over trivial matters. I believe, Miss Albright says carefully, that the quality of the potatoes has improved this week. It's a compliment to Mrs. Thornbury, obviously, but Miss Morrison immediately bristles. I found yesterday's potatoes perfectly adequate. Oh, I didn't mean to suggest otherwise, merely that today's are particularly well cooked, implying yesterday's weren't. You watch this exchange with the fascination usually reserved for watching someone defuse a bomb. They're arguing about potatoes. Scholars still argue whether the petty conflicts in Victorian boarding houses were symptoms of genuine personality clashes or inevitable results of cramming too many people into too small spaces with too little privacy. But watching Miss Albright and Miss Morrison nearly come to blows over root vegetables, you suspect it's both. Mr. Peterson breaks the tension by asking loudly for the salt, and knocking over his water glass in the process. Water spreads across the table while Elsie rushes over with a cloth, and in the chaos of mopping up, the potato controversy is forgotten. You suspect Peterson did it deliberately. He's too coordinated when sober to be that clumsy by accident. He's performed a public service, really. Charles catches your eye and makes an expression that perfectly conveys, "This is my life now and I've accepted it." You return a look that means, "At least the stew's decent." The meal continues with safer topics. Mr. Whittaker mentions something he read in the newspaper. Miss Fletcher describes a promising new student. The Mrs. Crawford continue their whispered parallel conversation. You eat steadily, savouring the hot food and the relative warmth of the room, because supper is the high point of the day, and once it's over, you're facing another evening of nothing much happening. Here's your quirky historical tidbit. Some boarding houses had rules against reading at the table because it was considered antisocial, while others encouraged it to prevent conversation that might lead to arguments. Mrs. Thornbury allows newspapers but not books, a distinction based on some etiquette logic you don't fully understand but aren't about to question. Dessert arrives. A rice pudding that's been made with what tastes like mostly water, and the memory of milk, but it's sweet, and it's warm, and nobody complains. You scrape your bowl clean because wasting food is both morally wrong and practically stupid when you don't know where your next decent meal is coming from. Mrs. Thornbury surveys the table, checking that everyone's eaten, that no one's secreting food in their pockets for later. It's been known to happen. That the social contract of communal dining has been fulfilled. "I trust everyone enjoyed their meal," she says, which isn't really a question. Everyone murmurs appropriate appreciation. Even Miss Morrison, who's constitutionally incapable of being fully satisfied with anything, manages a grudging nod. And that's supper. 2 hours of forced proximity, adequate food, carefully managed conversation, and the constant low-level tension of people who don't particularly like each other, pretending they do for the sake of maintaining respectability. Same time tomorrow, same people, same table, same careful navigation of personality conflicts and social hierarchies. Welcome to the main event. Try not to argue about the potatoes. Romance in a boarding house is theoretically impossible. Mrs. Thornbury's rules are crystal clear. No followers, no visitors of the opposite sex in rooms, no carrying on that might compromise the establishment's respectability. These rules are posted in the front hallway, written in Mrs. Thornbury's stern handwriting, and every new resident gets them recited during their first tour. The message is unambiguous. If you want romance, conduct it elsewhere, and definitely don't bring it through her front door. Naturally, everyone ignores this. Humans being humans, prohibition makes things more attractive, and the elaborate schemes residents devise to circumvent the no-followers rule would impress a military strategist. You're about to get a masterclass in Victorian romance logistics, boarding house edition, where love is expressed through complicated signal systems and bribed servants. It starts innocently enough. Miss Fletcher, the competent piano teacher from the second floor, begins receiving visits from a gentleman caller, a music shop owner named Mr. Hartley, who's been consulting with her about sheet music orders with suspicious frequency. These consultations happen in the parlour during approved visiting hours, with the door conspicuously open and Miss Morrison hovering nearby with her needlework, performing the role of unofficial chaperone/surveillance officer. But here's what you notice. Mr. Hartley arrives at 4 o'clock every Thursday. Miss Fletcher is always in the parlour by 10 minutes to 4, wearing her best dress, hair perfectly arranged. They sit on opposite settees, maintaining the proper distance required by Victorian courtship rules, and discuss Chopin in voices just loud enough to be overheard, which means they're performing respectability while their actual conversation happens through meaningful glances and carefully coded language. "I've received a new shipment of Brahms," Mr. Hartley says, and Miss Fletcher blushes, which seems like an extreme reaction to piano music unless Brahms means something else entirely. Here's your mainstream historical fact. Victorian courtship was heavily regulated by social conventions that required chaperoning, limited physical contact, and elaborate courtship rituals designed to ensure respectability. For working class and lower middle class couples meeting in boarding houses, these rules were both strictly enforced and creatively circumvented, creating a fascinating tension between propriety and actual human desire. Charles provides running commentary on the Fletcher-Hartley situation during one of your cold dinner sessions. "They're definitely courting," he whispers, watching through the dining room door as the couple maintains their respective positions in the parlor. "He's here twice a week now, always brings flowers, always stays exactly the permitted 45 minutes. Very proper, very suspicious." Why suspicious? Because proper courting doesn't require the back. Staircase signals. It takes you a moment to process this. The what? Charles grins like he's about to share state secrets. "You haven't noticed. Every Tuesday and Thursday evening around 9 o'clock, Miss Fletcher goes out to post letters. She's gone approximately 15 minutes. Mr. Hartley, I have on good authority, happens to be walking past the back entrance to this house at precisely 9:05 on those same evenings. They meet in the alley, exchange unchaperoned conversation, and Miss Fletcher returns looking remarkably cheerful for someone who's just visited a postbox. You're impressed by the espionage implications. How do you know this? I write at night. My room faces the back. I see things. He looks entirely too pleased with himself. Also, Elsie told me, she facilitates the whole operation, keeps Mrs. Thornbury distracted on cue. Miss Fletcher tips her a penny per successful rendezvous. This is how romance works in a boarding house. Elaborate schemes requiring multiple conspirators, careful timing, and the corruption of the help. Elsie has become the linchpin of several clandestine operations, accepting small bribes to look the other way or to time her cleaning round so that certain hallways are conveniently empty at crucial moments. At 14, she's already mastered the economics of discretion. But the Fletcher-Hartley situation is positively tame compared to Mr. Peterson's adventures. Remember Peterson, the travelling salesman with questionable morals and impressive audacity? He doesn't bother with the back staircase subtlety. He just smuggles women directly through the front door, relying on timing, distraction, and sheer brass nerve. His technique is almost admirable in its boldness. He arrives home around 7:30, slightly drunk, making noise in the front hallway to announce his presence. Mrs. Thornbury emerges to give him a warning look about the noise curfew. He apologises profusely, stumbles upstairs, and everyone thinks that's the end of it. But around 9 o'clock there's a quiet knock at the front door. Elsie, previously bribed, answers it. A woman, always respectably dressed, always carrying a basket suggesting legitimate business, asks for Mrs. Peterson in 3A. Elsie, maintaining plausible deniability, directs her upstairs. The woman disappears into Peterson's room. She leaves before midnight through the back entrance, which Elsie has conveniently left unlocked. Mrs. Thornbury absolutely knows this is happening. She's not stupid, and Peterson's cousins visit with remarkable frequency. But Peterson pays rent on time, and as long as he maintains a thin veneer of plausibility, she can pretend ignorance without compromising her own integrity. It's a delicate dance of mutual pretense. He pretends he's not flagrantly violating house rules, she pretends she doesn't notice, and the system continues functioning. Historians still argue whether Victorian boarding house landladies genuinely didn't know about romantic and sexual activities happening under their roofs, or whether they practiced strategic blindness to maintain occupancy rates. Mrs. Thornbury probably represents the latter. She'll enforce rules when they're broken too obviously, but subtle violations get ignored because evicting people means empty rooms means lost income. Here's your quirky historical tidbit. Some Victorian boarding houses actually had back staircases specifically designed for servants' use that became notorious as routes for romantic intrigue. The architectural feature meant for class separation got repurposed for secret meetings, and landlords who installed them, thinking they were maintaining propriety, actually created infrastructure for exactly the behaviour they wanted to prevent. The most elaborate scheme you witness involves Miss Albright's nephew, who visits monthly. He's a respectable-looking young man, properly dressed, who arrives during calling hours and spends time with his aunt in the parlour. Except Charles has it on good authority, meaning Elsie told him, that this nephew is actually a suitor, and Miss Albright's desperate financial situation means she's trying to land a husband while pretending she doesn't need one, which requires presenting herself as having family connections and social standing, rather than admitting she's an impoverished governess living in a boarding house. The nephew-suitor situation is almost sad. You watch them in the parlour, both performing their roles with obvious effort. He talks about family business that doesn't exist. She references a home she no longer has. They're courting through layers of fiction, and everyone knows it's fiction, but maintaining the fiction is essential to her chances of marriage, because admitting desperation would end those chances immediately. You find yourself rooting for them despite the absurdity. Let them have their coded conversations and their elaborate pretenses. Let Miss Fletcher meet Mr. Hartley in the alley for 15 stolen minutes of actual privacy. Let Peterson smuggle in his questionable companions. These small acts of rebellion against Mrs. Thornbury's rules are the only romance this building's going to see, and they're conducted with such elaborate care that they deserve to succeed. Of course, not every scheme works. Last month, apparently a resident named Miss Davies tried to sneak her beau in through the coal cellar entrance, and they got caught by Mrs. Thornbury doing a late-night inspection. Miss Davies was evicted within 24 hours, her belongings placed on the street, her reputation thoroughly destroyed. That's what happens when you're too obvious, when you fail to maintain the necessary fictions. The message is clear. Romance is permitted as long as it's deniable. Love, if you're going to indulge in it, must be conducted through proper channels, with elaborate precautions, and never ever in a way that forces Mrs. Thornbury to officially acknowledge it's happening. Welcome to Victorian courtship boarding house style, where love requires a conspiracy, romance needs a budget for bribes, and passion gets scheduled around laundry day. Winter hits the boarding house like a personal attack, and you realise that every comfort you took for granted during autumn, like being able to feel your fingers or sleep without shivering, was a temporary luxury. It's mid-November now, and the temperature inside the house is only marginally warmer than the temperature outside, which means your room hovers somewhere around 40 degrees on a good day and drops into the 30s at night. You can see your breath when you wake up. Frost forms on the inside of your window in fern-like patterns that would be beautiful if they didn't represent your impending hypothermia. The problem is coal. Everything comes down to coal. Mrs. Thornbury runs the heating system, such as it is, on a strict rationing schedule designed to keep everyone from actually dying while minimising her fuel costs. The boiler fires up at 6 in the morning and runs until 9, giving you 3 hours of tepid warmth drifting up through the old floor grates. Then it shuts off completely until 4 in the afternoon, when it fires up again until 10 at night. That's 9 hours of minimal heat per day, which sounds reasonable until you're living through the 15 hours of bone-deep cold that constitute the remainder of your existence. Here's your mainstream historical fact. Coal was expensive in Victorian Britain, especially for working-class households, and heating represented a significant portion of winter expenses. Boarding houses with 12 residents burning coal all day would face ruinous fuel bills, so strict rationing was economic necessity rather than cruelty. That doesn't make it any warmer, but it explains why Mrs. Thornbury treats the coal cellar like Fort Knox, and monitors consumption with the attention most people reserve for counting diamonds. You learn to structure your entire day around the heating schedule. Wake at 6 when the first warmth starts creeping through the floor grate. Stay in the dining room as long as possible during breakfast, because it's the warmest room in the house, positioned directly above the boiler. Spend the freezing middle hours either out at the library, which at least has its own heating, or huddled in your room wearing every piece of clothing you own layered on top of each other, like some kind of desperate textile experiment. Charted physical cold effects and thermal hierarchy. Good start. Let me continue with the physical effects of cold and the hierarchy of warmth. The hierarchy of warmth in the house becomes painfully obvious. Mr. Whittaker's second-floor room is the warmest, directly above the boiler, right next to the main chimney that serves the dining room fireplace. He probably lives in relative comfort, which he's earned through 7 years of reliable rent payment and social seniority. Miss Albright and Miss Morrison have rooms on the second floor too, benefiting from rising heat even if they're not positioned directly over the source. You're on the third floor rear, which means you're about as far from heat as you can get while still technically being inside the building. Whatever warmth makes it up this far has been diluted through 2 floors of drafty hallways and absorbed by all the residents between you and the boiler. Your floor grate provides a theoretical connection to the heating system, but in practice it mostly delivers cold air currents and the amplified sound of Mrs. Thornbury's voice from the dining room. Charles has developed a theory that Mrs. Thornbury deliberately prices rear third-floor rooms cheaper, not just because they're less desirable, but because she knows they'll be uninhabitable in winter, creating incentive for residents to pay for room upgrades. "It's brilliant, really," he says one evening. "Both of you sitting in your room wearing coats, scarves and gloves like we're preparing for an Arctic expedition. Charge us 4 shillings for a room that's livable 8 months a year, then watch us scramble to afford the 6 shilling second-floor rooms when November hits." He's not entirely wrong. You've already inquired about room availability on lower floors and been quoted prices you absolutely cannot afford. So you stay in your freezing garret and learn to adapt, which means learning creative methods of not dying of exposure in your own bedroom. The first purchase everyone makes is extra blankets. Mrs. Thornbury provides 2 per bed, thin wool things that have been washed so many times they're more holes than fabric. You need at least 4 more to achieve something resembling warmth, and blankets cost money you don't have. The rag and bone man who comes around Saturdays sells used blankets for 6p each, and you calculate that 2 extra blankets equals your food budget for 3 days. You buy them anyway, because freezing to death seems worse than being hungry, though by January you'll question this decision when your stomach's growling drowns out the sound of your teeth chattering. Here's where things get desperate: shared blankets and body heat. The Mrs. Crawford pioneered this technique years ago. They sleep in the same bed, pooling their blankets and their body warmth to survive the night. It's practical, economical, and deeply embarrassing when Miss Morrison discovers them and spreads rumours about inappropriate arrangements, which is rich coming from someone who's probably just jealous she doesn't have a sister to huddle with. Charles proposes that you and he should share rooms during winter, not in any improper way, just literally sleeping in shifts in whichever room is marginally warmer on a given night, combining blankets and taking turns with the one decent sleeping spot. You're cold enough to actually consider this before realising that if Miss Morrison found out, you'd both be evicted for moral turpitude faster than you could say hypothermia. So you suffer alone, developing the array of cold-related afflictions that Victorian boarding house residents know intimately. Chilblains arrive first. Those painful, itchy swellings on your fingers and toes caused by exposure to cold and damp. Your hands look like raw sausages, alternately numb and burning, and there's no real treatment except try to stay warm, which is spectacularly unhelpful advice when staying warm is the thing you physically cannot do. Your feet are worse. You've developed trench foot in your own bedroom, which seems like it should be impossible but apparently isn't. Your toes are permanently purple-blue, and putting on shoes in the morning requires 5 minutes of painful adjustment as circulation reluctantly returns. Historians still debate whether the casual acceptance of cold-related injuries in Victorian boarding houses constituted medical neglect or simply reflected the era's different standards for basic comfort. But when your toes are literally turning colours, the scholarly debate seems less relevant than finding warmer socks. The nightly debate about extra coal dominates dinner conversations throughout winter. Mrs. Thornbury offers additional heating for 3p per evening. She'll keep the boiler running past 10 o'clock until midnight if residents collectively pay for the extra fuel. But 3p split 12 ways is still a financial calculation everyone has to make individually, and the math gets complicated by the fact that heat distributes unevenly, meaning second-floor residents benefit more than third-floor residents from any extended burning. "I propose we pool resources," Mr. Whittaker announces one evening during the dinner-dessert course, his voice carrying the authority of senior resident. 3p divided 12 ways is a farthing each. Surely we can all manage that for 2 additional hours of heating. Miss Morrison immediately objects. A farthing adds up. That's 7p per week, over 3 shillings per month. Some of us are on fixed budgets. Some of us are also developing pneumonia, Miss Fletcher points out quietly, and everyone knows she's right. There's been a persistent cough working its way through the house, getting passed around like bad news, and cold is definitely exacerbating it. The vote happens informally. Who's willing to contribute to the coal fund? Mr. Whittaker? Yes. Miss Fletcher? Yes. Miss Albright? Reluctantly, yes. Miss Morrison? Grudgingly, yes, after being stared down by the majority. The Mrs. Crawford decline. They're fine with their shared bed arrangement. Mr. Peterson is travelling. Charles hesitates, looks at you, and you both reluctantly agree because 2 more hours of heat might mean the difference between sleeping and just lying there shivering until dawn. So Mrs. Thornbury collects the farthings and extends boiler time until midnight, and you stay in the parlour as long as possible, absorbing warmth like a reptile on a rock. The room fills with residents who normally avoid each other, all of us drawn together by thermal necessity. We sit in awkward silence, too cold to go upstairs, too proud to admit we're basically camping out to steal heat we've technically paid for. Here's your quirky historical tidbit. Some Victorian boarding houses had warming rooms, where residents could pay hourly rates to sit near a dedicated fire. It was like renting warmth by the hour, and it was considered less degrading than admitting you couldn't heat your own room. Mrs. Thornbury doesn't offer this service, but the parlour functions as an unofficial version. Everyone knows why we're all lingering past 10 o'clock, but nobody says it. You develop cold management strategies. You stuff newspaper in the gaps around your door and window. It's insulation and reading material, though the 1878 newspaper lining your drawer has become your primary entertainment. You wear your coat to bed, your scarf wrapped around your head like some kind of desperate nightcap. You sleep in your stockings and gloves. You pile every piece of clothing you own on top of your blankets, creating a nest that's heavy enough to restrict movement, but at least trap some body heat. The really desperate nights, you fill your wash basin with hot water from the evening kettle service. Mrs. Thornbury allows residents 1 kettle of hot water per night during winter, ostensibly for tea but actually because she's not completely heartless. And you hold your hands over the steam, absorbing what warmth you can before the water cools to room temperature, which takes approximately 6 minutes in your Arctic bedroom. Charles has started sleeping fully dressed, just removing his shoes and crawling under his blankets in his entire day's outfit. Saves time in the morning, he claims, but you both know it's because taking clothes off means 10 minutes of unbearable cold before you can get into bed, and then your clothes are freezing when you try to put them on at 6 a.m. Better to stay dressed and accept you're going to look rumpled. Winter in a boarding house isn't romantic or atmospheric. It's brutal, grinding, exhausting poverty that manifests as physical pain and constant discomfort. It's calculating whether you can afford an extra blanket or whether that money needs to go toward food. It's choosing between paying for extended heating or saving toward next week's rent. It's your body slowly shutting down non-essential functions to preserve core temperature, which means your hair stops growing and your fingernails turn brittle, and you're perpetually exhausted because your metabolism is working overtime just trying to keep you alive. And the worst part? This is January. You've got at least 2 more months of this before spring arrives and you remember what it feels like to be warm. The cough that's been circulating through the house for 3 weeks gets worse around mid-January, and everyone starts eyeing each other with a special paranoia reserved for potential disease carriers. It started with Mr. Peterson. He came back from a sales trip with what he claimed was just a cold, and proceeded to hack his way through 2 weeks of dinners, spraying God knows what across the dining table while everyone else tried not to breathe. Now half the house is coughing, and the question on everyone's mind is whether this is regular winter illness or something worse. Consumption is the word nobody wants to say out loud. Tuberculosis, if you're being medical about it. But Victorians prefer euphemisms for things that terrify them, and consumption terrifies everyone for good reason. It spreads through close contact, enclosed spaces, and shared air, which is basically a perfect description of boarding house living conditions. You're breathing the same air as 11 other people, using the same bathroom, touching the same door handles, eating at the same table. If one person has it, everyone's exposed. Here's your mainstream historical fact. Tuberculosis was the leading cause of death in Victorian Britain, killing roughly 1 in 4 people. It spread rapidly in crowded living conditions like boarding houses, factories, and tenements. There was no cure, limited treatment options, and diagnosis was often a death sentence that could take months or years to carry out. Victorian boarding houses were basically tuberculosis incubators, and everyone knew it, but couldn't afford to live anywhere else. Mrs. Thornbury has implemented what she calls sanitation protocols, which sound impressive until you realise they consist of opening windows for 15 minutes each morning, letting in freezing air that probably causes more illness than it prevents, wiping down surfaces with diluted carbolic acid, which makes everything smell like a hospital, and firmly suggesting that anyone coughing should take the air outside, where they'll freeze and probably die faster. The shared bathroom situation becomes nightmarish. Every time you use the water closet, you're acutely aware that 11 other people have been there before you, potentially leaving behind whatever invisible particles cause disease. You've started using your sleeve to turn the doorknob, holding your breath while you're in there, washing your hands with borderline obsessive thoroughness afterward. Charles has developed an entire ritual involving holding his breath, touching as few surfaces as possible, and then scrubbing his hands raw in the hallway sink. "Do you think Peterson has consumption?" he asks one evening, both of you lingering in the hallway after supper, rather than returning to our cold rooms. "He's been coughing for 3 weeks. That's not necessarily consumption, could just be bronchitis." "Could be," you agree, but neither of you sound convinced. The thing about consumption is that it starts like a regular cough, and then just continues. Months of coughing, weight loss, night sweats, and that distinctive blood-tinged sputum that confirms what everyone already feared. You've both heard the stories. Entire boarding houses evacuated when someone died of consumption in their room, the space fumigated and repainted, but never quite losing its reputation as a death house. Miss Morrison has taken it upon herself to police illness, with the same enthusiasm she brings to all her surveillance activities. She started refusing to sit near anyone who coughs, ostentatiously covering her mouth with a handkerchief whenever Peterson is in the room, and loudly suggesting that some people should consider recuperating elsewhere, for everyone's safety. Mrs. Thornbury tolerates this to a point, but you can see the calculation she's making: evict the sick tenant and lose that rent income, or keep them and risk losing multiple tenants who flee in fear of contagion. Here's your quirky historical tidbit. Some Victorian boarding houses actually advertised as consumption-free establishments, guaranteeing they'd maintain disease-free premises, though enforcement of these claims was basically non-existent. It was marketing more than medicine, but desperate people grasped at any promise of safety. The reality is that illness in a boarding house spreads like gossip, and right now both are epidemic. The cough passes from Peterson to Miss Fletcher, to one of the Crawford sisters, to Charles, to you. It's a dry hacking thing that feels like your lungs are trying to escape through your throat. You develop the boarding house cough technique, suppressing it during meals through sheer willpower, then retreating to your room to hack productively into a handkerchief that you'll need to wash yourself because God forbid you give it to Elsie, and risk spreading whatever this is to the 14-year-old. You examine your handkerchief obsessively after each coughing fit, looking for blood. That's the telltale sign, the thing that transforms bad cold into consumption diagnosis. So far nothing, just regular phlegm in shades of yellow and green that would be fascinating if they weren't coming from inside your own body. You're probably fine. This is probably just winter illness. Everyone gets winter illness in boarding houses because we're all cold, malnourished, stressed and living on top of each other. But the fear sits there anyway, cold and heavy in your chest. Or is that just the congestion? Hard to tell. Victorian medicine doesn't offer much clarity. Doctors, if you could afford one, you can't, would probably recommend fresh air, good food and rest, which is basically telling you to stop being poor. Some would prescribe cod liver oil or various patent medicines that do nothing except empty your wallet. The really progressive ones might suggest sanatorium treatment, which costs money you definitely don't have and involves leaving your job and home for months, which isn't exactly practical when you're already behind on rent, so you just continue. Keep coughing. Keep showing up to meals. Keep sharing space with 11 other potential vectors of disease. Keep pretending this is all normal and fine and definitely not terrifying. And then one morning, you wake to unusual silence. The morning bell doesn't ring at 6. You wait, confused, and finally venture out of your room around 1:15 to find other residents doing the same, everyone bleary and uncertain. The house feels wrong, the normal routine disrupted. Elsie appears on the stairs, her face pale. "Mrs. Thornbury says to stay in your rooms. Dr. Collins is coming." The whispers start immediately. Who is it? How bad? Is it consumption? The house holds its collective breath, waiting for information, for diagnosis, for someone to tell us whether we should be packing our bags and fleeing or whether this is containable. You learn later, through Charles, through Elsie, through the gossip network that functions faster than telegraphs, that Mr. Henderson from the second floor, not the Henderson who got evicted for rent, a different Henderson, collapsed last night. Fever, cough, confusion. The doctor arrives around 8, emerges around 9, and has a long conversation with Mrs. Thornbury in hushed tones that everyone strains to overhear. Pneumonia, apparently. Not consumption, thank God, but bad enough. Henderson is moved to the hospital. Mrs. Thornbury pays for the ambulance herself, which is either charitable or desperate to remove a sick person from her premises before everyone else gets infected. His room gets fumigated with burning sulphur. the acrid smell drifting through the entire house for hours. His belongings are packed up and stored. The room sits empty for 2 weeks while Mrs. Thornbury decides if it's safe to rent again. Historians still argue whether Victorian boarding house disease protocols did anything useful, or were just theatrical gestures meant to reassure frightened tenants. The sulphur fumigation probably didn't kill any actual disease particles, but it made the room smell aggressively clean, which psychologically helped even if medically it was useless. Henderson recovers eventually and returns 6 weeks later, thinner and weaker but alive. His survival reassures everyone slightly. See, people can get sick and not die. This isn't necessarily a death house. But the fear remains, that low-level awareness that you're always one cough, one fever, one bad week away from serious illness, in a place with no real medical support, and 11 other people who might catch whatever you've got. That's the reality of boarding house sanitation. Shared everything, limited cleaning, no real understanding of germ theory, and a collective prayer that whatever's going around stays mild enough not to kill anyone. You wash your hands obsessively. You avoid touching your face. You eat your meals and try not to think about everyone else's breath in the same air you're inhaling. Welcome to Victorian public health, where not dying of consumption counts as a successful outcome. Saturday night transforms the boarding house from its usual state of grim routine into something approaching actual human enjoyment. Though enjoyment is relative when your entertainment options are limited by poverty, Victorian morality, and Mrs. Thornbury's suspicious oversight. The week's labour is done, for those who have labour, and Sunday's enforced piety hasn't yet arrived, which creates a narrow window where people can relax without immediately sinning or working. What actually happens in that window reveals more about your fellow residents than weeks of polite breakfast conversation ever could. Mrs. Thornbury permits the parlour to remain open until 11 on Saturday nights, instead of the usual 10, which is her version of wild permissiveness. The gas lamps burn a bit brighter, someone's usually coaxed into playing the piano, and there's a general atmosphere of celebration that would be touching if it wasn't so desperate. These are people whose idea of excitement is staying up an extra hour in a room they're in every night anyway, but such is life when you're measuring entertainment against the backdrop of boarding house tedium. The respectable entertainment begins around 7:30. Miss Albright organises parlour games with the enthusiasm of someone who learned these activities at her ladies' academy, and believes they represent sophisticated amusement. Charades, naturally. 20 questions. Something called the minister's cat that involves alliteration and increasingly strained adjectives. You participate because refusing would mark you as antisocial, and you've learned that maintaining social standing in a boarding house requires showing up and pretending enthusiasm for activities that would bore a particularly patient corpse. Here's your mainstream historical fact. Victorian parlour games were serious business, considered essential for demonstrating refinement, wit, and cultural sophistication. Published game books sold thousands of copies, and knowing the proper rules was a marker of middle-class status. The games served social functions beyond entertainment. They provided structured interaction, opportunities for appropriate courtship, and demonstrations of one's education and quick thinking. Mr. Whittaker dominates charades with theatrical performances that suggest he missed his calling as an actor. He's surprisingly good, throwing himself into representations of Great Expectations and Industrial Revolution, with commitment that's both impressive and slightly unhinged. Miss Fletcher accompanies the games with piano music, providing atmospheric background that actually improves things. The Mrs. Crawford watch from their corner, occasionally whispering commentary that makes both of them giggle like schoolgirls, which is disconcerting coming from 70-year-old women in matching black dresses. Charles leans over during a particularly elaborate charade and whispers, "This is excruciating. I'd rather be working." "You're unemployed." "I'd rather be unemployed elsewhere." But around 9 o'clock, the parlour entertainment splinters into factions, and this is where things get interesting. The truly respectable residents, Miss Albright, Miss Morrison, the Crawford sisters, settle in for hymn singing. Miss Fletcher gamely transitions from parlour game music to sacred songs, and they work through Abide With Me and Rock of Ages, with the solemnity of people who believe this is what Saturday evening was designed for. It's performatively pious, yes, but it's also genuinely what they enjoy, and there's something almost touching about their commitment to maintaining respectability even during leisure time. Meanwhile, Mr. Peterson has stepped out for air around 8:30 and not returned. Everyone knows he's at a pub somewhere, possibly several pubs, conducting what he calls market research, and what everyone else calls getting drunk on gin that costs more than you can afford. He'll return around midnight stumbling and cheerful, and Mrs. Thornbury will pretend not to notice because evicting your most reliable rent payer over alcohol consumption seems counterproductive to running a business. Here's where you and Charles make your own escape. There's a music hall about 15 minutes walk from here, the Palace of Varieties, though calling it a palace is generous. It's a loud, smoky, slightly disreputable establishment where performers sing popular songs, comedians tell jokes that wouldn't survive parlor game censorship, and the audience drinks and yells encouragement. Tickets cost 3p for standing room, which is exactly 3p more than you should be spending, but you've been cooped up in that boarding house for a week, and you need to be somewhere, anywhere else. The trick is leaving without advertising where you're going. You don't lie to Mrs. Thornbury, that would be disrespectful, but you don't exactly clarify your destination either. Going out for the evening, Mum, covers everything from church services to opium dens, and her knowing look suggests she understands perfectly well you're not attending additional prayer meetings. She nods, notes the time in her mental ledger, and reminds you that the front door locks at midnight sharp. The music hall is packed with clerks, shop girls, and working people who've scraped together pennies for entertainment. The air is thick with tobacco smoke and the smell of spilled beer. The atmosphere is joyfully chaotic. People singing along with performers, shouting jokes back at comedians, stamping feet during popular songs. It's the opposite of the boarding house's constrained respectability, and you drink it in like someone dying of thirst. Scholars still argue whether Victorian music halls represented working-class cultural resistance or mere escapism from grinding poverty. But standing here watching a comedian mock politicians while the audience roars approval, you're not particularly concerned with the sociology. This is fun. Actual, uncomplicated fun. And you've forgotten what that feels like. Here's your quirky historical tidbit. Music halls were considered so morally suspect that respectable middle-class people who attended them, and many did, often lied about it afterward, claiming they were somewhere else entirely. The venues were associated with drinking, loose women, and general moral degradation. Though the actual entertainment was usually fairly tame by modern standards, the scandal was more about class mixing than actual content. Charles buys you both a glass of beer that cost a penny, and tastes like it cost considerably less. You stand in the back, watching performers cycle through, a singer doing popular ballads, a comedian telling stories about his mother-in-law, a juggler who drops things but makes it part of the act. It's not sophisticated. It's probably not even good. But it's real human entertainment created for actual enjoyment rather than moral improvement, and that makes it worth every penny you can't afford. You return to the boarding house at 1:45, faces flushed from beer and laughter, trying to compose yourselves into respectability before entering. Mrs. Thornbury is waiting in the hallway, of course she is, and she examines you both with an expression that clearly says, "I know exactly where you've been, and I'm choosing not to comment." "Enjoyable evening?" she asks neutrally. "Very respectable, ma'am," Charles replies with a completely straight face. "I'm sure it was." She makes a note in her ledger, probably marking down your return time, and dismisses you with a nod. Upstairs you can hear the hymn singers finishing their final song, their voices drifting through the halls in perfect Victorian propriety. You've been to the music hall. They've been singing sacred music. Peterson's probably passed out in an alley somewhere. Miss Fletcher and Mr. Hartley are definitely conducting unchaperoned romance via the back staircase signal system. Everyone's Saturday night reveals exactly who they are when the rigid weekly structure relaxes just slightly. Welcome to weekend entertainment, where respectability and actual fun engage in carefully negotiated warfare, and everybody lies about what they actually did. Sunday arrives with the oppressive weight of enforced holiness, and if you thought the boarding house had rules during the week, you're about to discover that the Sabbath operates under an entirely different level of restrictive piety. Mrs. Thornbury takes Sunday observance seriously, not just personally, which would be fine, but institutionally, which means everyone in the house is expected to perform Christianity, whether they feel particularly devout or not. You're going to church, you're going to wear proper clothing, you're going to be quiet, respectable, and demonstrably moral for the entire day. Welcome to Victorian Sunday, where fun comes to die and takes your soul with it. The morning. Bell rings at 7 instead of 6, Mrs. Thornbury's one concession to Sabbath rest, but you're expected to be dressed in your absolute best by 8:30 for church departure at 9. And when Victorians say Sunday best, they mean it. This isn't your weekday work clothes with a fresh collar. This is proper Sunday attire that broadcasts your respectability to God and your neighbours in equal measure. Men need dark suits, clean shirts, polished boots. Women need their most presentable dresses, proper bonnets, gloves even in summer. The Mrs. Crawford appear in matching black silk that they've been preserving for decades, looking like matching Victorian monuments to aggressive piety. You've got exactly one outfit that qualifies as Sunday appropriate, a suit that's been carefully maintained, brushed weekly, and protected from daily wear specifically for this purpose. It's slightly too large because you've lost weight since buying it, and slightly shiny at the elbows because it's old, but it's clean and it's complete, and it announces that you're a respectable person who owns proper church clothes. That's all that matters. Here's your mainstream historical fact. Victorian Sunday observance was legally enforced in many areas through blue laws that prohibited most forms of commerce, entertainment, and labour. Church attendance wasn't technically mandatory, but was socially compulsory for anyone hoping to maintain middle-class respectability. Missing church without a good reason, illness, family emergency, marked you as morally suspect and potentially irreligious, which could damage your employment prospects and social standing. Mrs. Thornbury conducts an inspection in the front hallway at 8:45. She's dressed in her finest black dress with jet beading that probably cost more than 3 months of your rent. Her hair perfectly arranged, her expression suggesting she's personally responsible for delivering her entire household to the Lord's presence in acceptable condition. She looks you over, checking that your collar is clean, your shoes are polished, your general appearance won't embarrass her in front of the congregation. Acceptable, she pronounces, which is her highest compliment. You've passed Sunday inspection. The boarding house residents process to church together, walking in a group that's supposed to demonstrate communal respectability, but actually looks like a reluctant parade of economic anxiety dressed up in its best clothes. St. Barnabas is 4 streets away, close enough that you don't need omnibus fare, but far enough that the walk provides opportunity for the neighbourhood to observe your household's piety. Mrs. Thornbury leads naturally. Mr. Whittaker walks beside her, the senior residents forming the respectable vanguard. The rest of you trail behind in rough hierarchical order, and you notice that pedestrians we pass definitely judge which boarding house you're from based on your group's appearance. This is public relations. This is advertising. This is Mrs. Thornbury protecting her establishment's reputation by proving her lodgers are church-going, moral individuals and not the desperate poor living in cramped quarters and sharing bathrooms. The service lasts 2 hours. 2 full hours. The pews are hard, the church is cold despite being packed with bodies, and the vicar has opinions about sin that he shares at extraordinary length. You sit in the section reserved for Mrs. Thornbury's household, surrounded by other boarding house contingents and respectable families, all of us performing Christianity with varying degrees of conviction. Miss Morrison sings the hymns with aggressive piety. Miss Albright maintains perfect posture throughout, demonstrating her genteel upbringing. The Mrs. Crawford share a hymnal and whisper-sing in harmony. Charles stares at the ceiling like he's calculating whether jumping from the gallery would be fatal or just very painful. Here's your quirky historical tidbit. Some Victorian boarding houses actually fined residents for missing church, 3p per absence, both as enforcement of moral standards and as a profit centre. Mrs. Thornbury doesn't go quite that far, but she maintains a mental record of attendance, and repeated absence would definitely factor into rent renewal decisions. You return to the boarding house around noon, and this is where Sunday becomes truly oppressive. The afternoon stretches ahead with nothing permitted except quiet moral activities. No loud conversation, no work of any kind, no music except hymns, no reading except religious texts or possibly very serious literature, no games, no laughter that might be construed as frivolous. You're supposed to spend the afternoon in contemplation, prayer, Bible study, or possibly napping, though even napping feels vaguely sinful when you're supposed to be focusing on spiritual improvement. The parlour fills with residents engaging in performative piety. Miss Morrison reads her Bible with the focus of someone taking an examination. Miss Albright writes letters, probably to her fictional nephew-suitor with careful propriety. Mr. Whittaker reads Sunday newspapers, which are permitted because they report on serious matters and don't constitute entertainment. You and Charles sit in uncomfortable chairs pretending to read improving literature, while actually just enduring the hours until this day ends. The silence is crushing. No piano music, no conversation beyond hushed whispers. The house feels like it's holding its breath, waiting for Monday when normal life can resume. Even the children playing in the street outside seem muted, aware that Sunday requires quiet from everyone, not just the adults trapped in boarding houses, and then comes Sunday supper, which is punishment disguised as a meal. There's no hot food on Sunday. Mrs. Thornbury doesn't cook on the Sabbath because cooking is work and work violates the day's sanctity. Instead, you get cold meat. That mutton again, its third appearance this week. Bread, cheese, and pickles. It's not exactly appetizing on a good day, but after 2 hours in a cold church and an afternoon of enforced quietness, it's positively depressing. Historians still argue whether Victorian Sunday restrictions represented genuine religious devotion or social control mechanisms designed to regulate working-class leisure time. But sitting here eating cold mutton in silence, while Mrs. Thornbury monitors everyone's moral comportment, the distinction seems academic. This is control. This is surveillance. This is a reminder that even your leisure time isn't really yours. It belongs to social expectations and religious obligations that you can't escape because escaping would mark you as disreputable. The evening is more of the same. Hymn singing resumes in the parlor. It's literally the only entertainment permitted. You mouth along to "Nearer my God to thee," while privately thinking that being nearer to literally anywhere else would be preferable. Miss Fletcher plays piano with less enthusiasm than usual, clearly exhausted by the day's mandatory spirituality. Even the Crawford sisters seem worn down, their whispered conversation lacking its usual animation. Mrs. Thornbury circulates through the parlor, checking that everyone's engaged in appropriate Sunday activities, her presence a constant reminder that you're being observed and evaluated. This is her power on full display. She's not just your landlady, she's the moral guardian of this household, and Sunday is when she exercises that authority most completely. Peterson is conspicuously absent. He claimed a sudden need to visit his ailing mother around 10 this morning and hasn't returned. Everyone knows he's escaped to somewhere that doesn't observe the Sabbath quite so strictly. Probably a pub in a neighbourhood where blue laws aren't as rigidly enforced. You envy him while also knowing he'll pay for this. Mrs. Thornbury notices everything, and this absence will be noted, recorded, and held against him. By 9 o'clock you're so desperate for the day to end that your cold room actually seems appealing. At least there you can stop performing piety and just be miserably uncomfortable in private. The boarding house releases its residents in gradual stages, everyone retreating to their rooms with obvious relief, the oppressive sanctity of Sunday finally lifting. Tomorrow is Monday, laundry day. The week's grinding routine will resume. But at least it won't be Sunday. The house rules are posted in the front hallway on a framed card that's been there so long the paper has yellowed to the colour of old teeth. You pass it every single day, and after the first week you stop actually reading it. But the rules are burned into your consciousness through sheer repetition, and Mrs. Thornbury's periodic reminders during rent collection. They're comprehensive, strict, and as you've discovered over the past weeks, almost universally, ignored by everyone including the person who wrote them. Let's review the official regulations of number 47 Marchmont Street, as posted and theoretically enforced. No alcohol on the premises under any circumstances, no visitors in resident rooms at any time, no noise after 10 o'clock evening or before 7 o'clock morning, no cooking in rooms, no washing or bathing except during designated hours, no pets, no smoking in bedrooms, no entertaining of the opposite sex without proper chaperoning, church attendance expected, rent due, Fridays without exception, management reserves the right to inspect rooms at any time, violation of rules may result in immediate eviction. It's an impressive list of prohibitions that would create a perfectly orderly, quiet, moral household if anyone actually followed them. Naturally nobody does, and the gap between posted rules and actual behaviour is where boarding house life really happens. Here's your mainstream historical fact. Victorian boarding houses operated on elaborate systems of stated rules and unstated tolerances, with landladies selectively enforcing regulations based on rent, payment reliability, social standing, and how obviously the violations occurred. The rules existed partly for actual governance and partly as legal protection. If something went wrong, the landlady could point to posted regulations and claim she'd done everything possible to prevent bad behaviour. Take the alcohol prohibition. It's absolute, unambiguous, printed in capital letters, and yet Mr. Peterson maintains what can only be described as a private bar in his room. You've heard the distinctive clink of bottles, caught the smell of gin in the hallway outside his door, and witnessed him stumbling upstairs after evenings that definitely involved substances banned by house rules. Mrs. Thornbury knows. Everyone knows. But Peterson pays rent on time, and his drinking happens behind a closed door where she can maintain plausible deniability. The rule exists. The violation exists. Both coexist peacefully, as long as Peterson doesn't get so drunk he disturbs other residents or burns down the building. Charles has a half bottle of whiskey hidden in his room right now. He showed it to you during one of your commiseration sessions about the cold. Emergency medicinal supply, he claims with a grin, for when the winter gets truly unbearable and suicide starts looking attractive. You've both drunk from it on particularly miserable nights, violating house rules while sitting in his freezing room complaining about the house rules. The hypocrisy doesn't escape either of you, but survival requires small rebellions. The no visitors in rooms rule gets violated so creatively, you've started mentally cataloguing the techniques. You've already learned about Miss Fletcher's back staircase romance and Peterson's cousin rotation. But there's also Miss Davies from 2D, who receives dressmaking clients in her room at odd hours, clients who arrive with suspicious frequency and leave looking rumpled. Everyone pretends not to notice. Mrs. Thornbury occasionally makes pointed comments about appropriate business arrangements, but as long as the rent arrives on schedule, enforcement remains theoretical. Here's your quirky historical tidbit. Some Victorian boarding houses actually had separate entrances for male and female visitors, creating architectural solutions to moral concerns. Mrs. Thornbury's building predates this innovation, so she relies instead on strategic blindness and the hope that residents won't be too obvious about their rule violations. The noise curfew is perhaps the most consistently violated rule, mainly because it's physically impossible to maintain complete silence in a building where 12 people live separated by walls thin enough to hear conversations. The Crawford sisters snore, both of them, in stereo, creating a nighttime symphony that echoes through the third floor. Mr. Whittaker has insomnia and paces his room until 2 a.m, his floorboards creaking with each circuit. Someone on the second floor plays music hall songs on what sounds like a tin whistle around midnight at least twice a week. Mrs. Thornbury's enforcement of the noise rule is selective and seemingly arbitrary. She'll absolutely come down on someone for loud conversation after 10, but systematic snoring gets ignored because what can anyone do about it? The midnight tin whistle periodically results in a stern talking to, but it keeps happening, suggesting either the talks aren't that stern or the tin whistle player doesn't care. You've learned that no noise actually means no noise that annoys Mrs. Thornbury specifically, or that enough residents complain about to force her intervention. The cooking prohibition exists for legitimate fire safety reasons. Spirit lamps and open flames in wooden buildings with multiple occupants is genuinely dangerous. And yet half the residents have spirit lamps for heating water, making tea, warming food, and occasionally cooking full meals. You've smelled fried sausages coming from somewhere on the second floor. Charles has been known to heat soup in his room. Miss Morrison, the moral enforcer herself, definitely makes toast using a toasting fork over her spirit lamp because you've seen her carrying bread and smelled the distinctive scent of burning bread drifting from her room. Mrs. Thornbury's position on cooking violations seems to be, don't burn down my house, and don't be obvious about it. She'll inspect rooms periodically, notice the spirit lamps, and say nothing as long as they're not actively creating fire hazards. It's practical enforcement. She knows residents need hot water and warm food. She understands the economics that make in-room food preparation essential, and she's decided that unstated tolerance is better than rigid enforcement that would make her look unreasonable. The room inspection clause. Management reserves the right to inspect rooms at any time. Theoretically gives Mrs. Thornbury unlimited surveillance power. In practice, she uses it sparingly and usually with warning. You get a day's notice before she arrives to check that you're not destroying the furniture, hiding prohibited pets, or operating an illegal business. This gives everyone time to hide their alcohol, stash their spirit lamps, remove any evidence of visitors, and generally create the appearance of rule following that satisfies her need for control without actually requiring genuine compliance. But, and this is critical, there are limits. The rules can be bent, but they cannot be broken too obviously or too flagrantly without consequences. When Miss Davies from last month, different from the current Miss Davies, got caught with a man in her room at midnight, she was evicted within hours. When Mr. Henderson fell 3 weeks behind on rent, his belongings were on the street by Friday morning despite his promises. When someone on the second floor started cooking full dinners that set off smoke throughout the building, they received an ultimatum, stop or leave. The system works through an elaborate dance of violation and tolerance, enforcement and blindness. Everyone breaks the rules. Mrs. Thornbury knows everyone breaks the rules. But as long as you maintain the fiction of compliance, pay your rent, and don't create problems that force her to officially notice, the rules remain posted but unenforced, present but not particularly relevant. You've become complicit in this system. You pretend to follow rules you're violating. You ignore other residents' violations while conducting your own. You perform compliance during inspections while maintaining hidden contraband. It's exhausting and slightly absurd, but it's how boarding house life actually functions, not through rigid rule enforcement, but through negotiated tolerance and strategic ignorance. Welcome to the real regulations. Don't get caught, don't make problems, pay your rent on time, and everyone can pretend the posted rules mean something. You wake up on a Thursday morning to shouting from the floor below, and you know immediately that someone's getting evicted. There's a particular quality to eviction arguments, desperate, angry, pleading all at once, that's unmistakable once you've heard it. You lie in bed for a moment, listening to the muffled voices escalate, and feel that cold twist of fear that comes from knowing this could be you. Next week, next month, whenever your luck runs out. By the time you're dressed and heading downstairs, the drama has moved to the front hallway, where it can achieve maximum public humiliation. Miss Davies, the current one, the one with the dressmaking clients, is standing in her outdoor clothes, her belongings piled in the hallway in 2 shabby carpet bags and a trunk that's seen better decades. Mrs. Thornbury stands near the door, arms crossed, face set in that expression that suggests she's heard every excuse and believes precisely none of them. "I'll have the money by tomorrow, I swear it," Miss Davies is saying, her voice shaking somewhere between rage and tears. "Just one more day, please, just—" "You said that last week, and the week before." Mrs. Thornbury's voice is flat, businesslike, completely devoid of sympathy. "You're 5 weeks in arrears, Miss Davies. 5 weeks. I've been more than patient. Here's your mainstream historical fact. Victorian boarding house evictions were swift, brutal, and legally straightforward. Landlords had enormous power over tenants, and failure to pay rent could result in immediate eviction, with belongings placed on the street. The workhouse loomed as the next stop for people who couldn't secure alternative housing, and its threat was enough to keep most residents paying whatever they could, however they could. Other residents have gathered to watch, because apparently nothing brings a boarding house together like witnessing someone else's catastrophic failure. Mr. Whittaker observes from the parlor doorway with the detached interest of someone watching a stage performance. Miss Morrison stands at the top of the stairs wearing an expression of righteous satisfaction. She'd reported Miss Davies' suspicious visitors weeks ago, and here's her vindication. The Crawford sisters hover in their doorway, whispering intensely. Charles appears next to you, still buttoning his collar, and mutters, "Christ," under his breath. "I have prospects," Miss Davies insists, and you can hear the desperation now, the pleading note that makes you want to look away. "A position, starting Monday, good wages. Then you'll have no trouble securing new lodgings with your first week's wages." Mrs. Thornbury gestures to the door. "I'm sorry, Miss Davies, but I cannot continue to house residents who don't pay. I have my own obligations." "Where am I supposed to go?" The question comes out as almost a wail, and the silence that follows is terrible because everyone knows the answer. The workhouse, the street, friends or family if you're lucky enough to have them, which Miss Davies clearly isn't. These are the only options for people who can't afford 4 shillings weekly for a bed and 2 meals. Here's what nobody says out loud. Miss Davies probably doesn't have a position starting Monday. That's the lie people tell when they're about to become homeless, the desperate fiction that maintains some shred of dignity. Everyone in this hallway knows it's a lie. Mrs. Thornbury knows. Miss Davies probably knows. but saying it out loud would make everything even worse, so the fiction persists right up until the door closes. You watch Miss Davies pick up her carpet bags with shaking hands. The trunk is too heavy for her to carry alone, and there's this awful moment where you can see her calculating whether to ask for help, whether any of these watching residents will assist her, whether she has any allies left in this house. Nobody moves. Helping someone getting evicted feels too much like endorsing their failure, like catching poverty through association. Elsie finally steps forward, 14-year-old Elsie, who probably makes 3p a week, and helps Miss Davies drag the trunk to the door. It's a small kindness that makes everyone else's inaction look even worse. They wrestle it over the threshold and onto the front steps, and then Elsie retreats back inside, her part in this tragedy complete. Mrs. Thornbury speaks again, and her voice has softened just slightly, which somehow makes it worse. "I genuinely wish you well, Miss Davies. I hope you find your feet." Then she closes the door, and Miss Davies is on the other side of it, alone on the street with her belongings and nowhere obvious to go. The hallway clears quickly. Nobody wants to linger. Nobody wants to discuss what just happened, because discussing it means acknowledging that we're all one bad month away from the same fate. You return to your room and find your hands are shaking. You count your money again. 1 shilling and 4p until you find work. Rent is due tomorrow. You have exactly enough, but that leaves you with 4p for the entire next week, and 4p doesn't go far when you need to eat and you need to stay presentable enough to find employment. Charles appears at your door around noon. "Did you see?" "I saw. 5 weeks. That's all it took. 5 bad weeks and she's out." Here's your quirky historical tidbit. Some Victorian charities actually tracked boarding house evictions and would station volunteers near known houses on rent day Fridays to intercept newly homeless people before they reached the workhouse. It was damage control more than prevention, but it saved some people from the worst fate available to the urban poor. You both know what happens now. Miss Davies will try Friends if she has any. She'll pawn whatever she can from those carpet bags. She'll spend a few nights in increasingly desperate accommodations. Maybe a doss house where a bed costs 2p and you sleep in a room with 30 strangers. And if none of that works, if the money runs out completely, there's the workhouse, the casual ward for the destitute, where you give up your freedom, your possessions, your dignity in exchange for a roof and minimal food. People go into workhouses and sometimes don't come out for years, or ever. "I'm 3 weeks ahead on rent," Charles says quietly. "Got paid for an article, but that money's gone in 3 weeks, and I don't have another commission lined up. So I'm Miss Davies in 3 weeks if nothing changes." "We're all Miss Davies eventually," you reply, and it's true. That's the terrible mathematics of boarding house life. You're always counting weeks, always calculating when your resources run out, always aware that the gap between housed and homeless is measured in shillings and Fridays. That evening at supper, Miss Davies' empty seat at the table is conspicuous, and nobody mentions it. Mrs. Thornbury serves the meal as usual, her face betraying nothing. The rule violations you've all been conducting. The hidden alcohol, the late-night visitors, the spirit lamps, the creative interpretations of house regulations suddenly seem riskier. You've been bending rules, but Miss Davies broke them too obviously, got reported by Miss Morrison, and when combined with unpaid rent, it provided the perfect excuse for eviction. The message is clear. You can break the rules as long as you pay your rent. But fall behind on payment and suddenly those overlooked violations become evidence, ammunition, justification for putting your belongings on the street. You lie awake that night thinking about Miss Davies, wondering where she is, whether she found shelter, whether she's already at the workhouse or still trying to avoid it. You'll never know. People disappear from boarding houses and they just disappear. You don't get updates. You don't hear outcomes. They're gone, and the empty room gets rented to someone else, and life continues. That's the worst part. How quickly someone becomes erased. How fast a person goes from daily presence to forgotten absence. Miss Davies lived here for months. Now her room's being fumigated and her seat at breakfast tomorrow will be occupied by someone new who'll never know she existed. Welcome to the economics of survival, where 5 bad weeks can destroy your life and everyone watches because they're all secretly counting their own weeks, calculating their own proximity to disaster. 10 o'clock brings the nightly ritual of gas reduction, and you've learned to recognise the exact moment when Mrs. Thornbury turns down the main supply from her quarters below. The gas lights throughout the house dim simultaneously, their yellow glow fading to a weak flicker that casts more shadow than light. This is the boarding house's way of announcing bedtime, not by command, but by removing the illumination necessary for doing anything else. You're not forbidden from staying awake, but you're strongly encouraged to do it in the dark. The house begins its nightly transformation from day space to night space, and the sounds change accordingly. Footsteps creak on stairs as residents make their final trips to the water closet. Doors open and close with varying degrees of care. Mr. Whittaker's measured click, the Crawford sisters' synchronized double closing, Peterson's slightly drunk fumbling with his lock. Water runs in sinks as people conduct their evening ablutions, the pipes groaning and rattling as Victorian plumbing does its Victorian plumbing things. Someone coughs, that persistent winter cough that's been circulating for weeks, and someone else whispers a sharp shh that echoes through the thin walls. You light your candle from the dying gaslight, watching the flame catch and steady. This single candle represents your entire evening illumination budget until you blow it out and surrender to darkness. Some residents burn candles until midnight or later, reading or writing or simply delaying the moment when they have to lie down in cold beds in colder rooms. You've learned to ration your candle time carefully. Maybe an hour of reading. Maybe just 30 minutes of sitting and thinking before committing to the long cold night ahead. Here's your mainstream historical fact. Victorian boarding house residents often experience profound loneliness, despite being surrounded by people. The combination of crowded living conditions and enforced social distance, everyone performing respectability, maintaining boundaries, avoiding genuine intimacy, created a peculiar isolation where you could hear your neighbours' every sound but never really know them. You're alone together, a dozen people living separate lives in uncomfortable proximity. The sounds of the house settling become your evening entertainment. You learn to identify residents by their nighttime noises. Miss Morrison's aggressive teeth-brushing routine that goes on for a full 5 minutes. Miss Fletcher's quiet humming as she prepares for bed. Charles's restless pacing when he can't sleep. The Crawford sisters conduct their nighttime whispering session, their voices carrying through walls in a murmur that's more rhythm than words. Mr. Whittaker's snoring starts around 11 and continues until dawn, a deep resonant sound that you've learned to incorporate into your own sleep patterns, because blocking it out is impossible. Somewhere on the second floor someone's crying. You hear it faintly through the heating grate. Soft, muffled sobbing that goes on for maybe 10 minutes before stopping. You'll never know who it was or why. That's boarding house life, bearing witness to fragments of other people's private misery without context or resolution. Tomorrow at breakfast everyone will be composed and proper, and whoever was crying tonight will show no evidence of their breakdown. Privacy is performed through collective pretense. You blow out your candle around 11, conserving the last 2 inches for tomorrow night. Darkness floods your room completely. Not the darkness of country nights where stars provide some illumination, but the absolute darkness of a city room with a window facing a brick wall. You lie in bed, wrapped in your inadequate blankets plus your coat plus yesterday's clothes, because layering is survival, and you listen to the house breathe around you. Here's your quirky historical tidbit. Some Victorian boarding house residents reported experiencing intense dreams and vivid nightmares, which modern scholars attribute to poor nutrition, stress, cold sleeping conditions, and the psychological pressure of precarious living situations. Your dreams lately have been anxious things, chasing jobs that disappear, counting money that evaporates, running from eviction notices that pursue you through endless hallways. But tonight, lying in the dark listening to Mr. Whittaker's snoring and the distant sound of the night watchman calling the hour outside, you let yourself imagine something different. Maybe you'll find steady work next week. Maybe you'll save enough to rent a better room, maybe even a small flat of your own someday. Maybe this boarding house existence is temporary, a difficult chapter that will make a good story later when you're safely past it. It's probably fantasy. Statistics aren't on your side. Most people who live in boarding houses die in boarding houses or move to worse accommodations. Upward mobility is rare enough to be remarkable, but lying here in the dark with nothing but hope to keep you warm, you let yourself believe anyway. Because the alternative, accepting that this cold room, this shared bathroom, this breakfast table hierarchy is permanent, would make getting up tomorrow impossible. The house creaks and settles, finding its nighttime equilibrium. Pipes tick as they cool. Floorboards contract in the cold. Outside, a carriage passes, its wheels rattling over cobblestones. A dog barks somewhere distant. London continues its business while you drift towards sleep, another resident in another boarding house on another unremarkable night. Tomorrow you'll wake to Elsie's bell, you'll fight for hot water and bathroom access, you'll eat lukewarm porridge at your designated seat, you'll navigate house politics and count your remaining shillings and try not to think about Miss Davies sleeping rough somewhere or worse. You'll survive another day in this peculiar purgatory of the respectable poor, where you're housed but never home, surrounded but alone, living but not quite alive. But that's tomorrow. Tonight you're warm enough not to die, fed enough not to starve, and sheltered enough to call it shelter. In the mathematics of Victorian poverty, that counts as success. The house grows quieter now, the last sounds fading into stillness. Mr. Whittaker's snoring becomes almost rhythmic, almost soothing in its predictability. Even the pipes have stopped their complaining. You feel your body, relaxing into the mattress despite its lumps and valleys, your muscles unclenching from the day's tensions. The cold seems less aggressive somehow, more like a presence you've made peace with than an enemy you're fighting. Your thoughts drift and scatter, losing their sharp edges. The worried calculations about next week's rent blur into vaguer concerns that don't require immediate solutions. You remember Charles's laugh at something you said during cold dinner. You remember the way the gaslight caught Miss Fletcher's hair during piano hour. Small moments of ordinary humanity in an otherwise difficult existence. They're enough. They have to be enough. Sleep creeps closer, gentle and inevitable. Your breathing deepens, matching the slow rhythm of the sleeping house around you. Somewhere in your half-dreaming mind, you're already moving forward, past this room, past this house, towards some imagined future where you've got steady work and warm rooms and problems that aren't measured in shillings and Fridays. It's a good dream. Let yourself have it. The boarding house holds you loosely in its crowded embrace. Not home, but shelter. Not family, but familiar. Not chosen. But for now, enough. Tomorrow will come with its demands and its disappointments. But tonight, here in the darkness with a dozen other souls sleeping in their cold rooms around you, you're exactly where you need to be. Not because it's good, but because it's what you've got, and sometimes that's the same thing. Rest now. Let the house settle. Let your worries wait until morning. You've made it through another day in this strange, difficult, peculiar place. That's victory enough. Close your eyes. Let the darkness hold you. Tomorrow you'll face it all again, but tonight just sleep. Just breathe. Just be. You're going to be all right. Maybe not today, maybe not next week, but someday, hold on to that. Let it carry you into dreams, sweet dreams.